The bowl of water was still when the first servant set it at her feet. She did not look down. Her eyes remained half closed, drifting somewhere between dream and dawn. The water was tinted faint pink by hibiscus petals that floated like silent embers. The petals had been crushed at night, their crimson hue bleeding into the water until it smelled of tart sweetness, sharp, almost electric on the tongue of the air. 2 more servants knelt, one on either side, each holding a cluster of pomegranate leaves bound by a thin golden thread. She inhaled, and the scent rose in her nostrils, green and sweet, a cool green flash in an otherwise perfumed world. Without a word, she extended her right foot. The servant on her right dipped a leaf into the bowl and began to brush it across the arch, sweeping the skin gently. The surface glowed in the low light, dew fresh and faintly rosy. Each stroke was deliberate, unhurried, as though time itself had slowed to match the rhythm of leaf on skin. At the same moment, the left servant repeated the motion on her other foot, working tip to heel in a single confident sweep. A drop of water escaped the hibiscus petals and slid down her ankle, vanishing under the golden cuff of her bracelet. No one spoke. No one looked, except at the task at hand. When both feet were cleansed, the servant switched to the next phase. Bronze knives, their edges polished until they reflected the pale beams of morning light. She felt the soft scrape against her calves, the metallic whisper of blade on skin. It was not pain that came first, but a curious rush, a faint breeze on flesh. Each pass of the blade lifted the slightest shadows of dust and the ghost of earlier oils. The servants worked from calf to knee, then thigh, moving downward in perfect harmony until every inch of her legs had been renewed. She sat with hands folded, body still, as if embodying the very statue Isis, whose temple she had entered only days before. When the scraping ended, linen strips soaked in pomegranate leaf distillate were lit on small braziers. The scent changed, becoming softer, fruitier, almost honeyed. A servant held the strip before her hands, then, with a practiced flick, the flame danced over the linen until it glowed crimson at the edges. The air tasted of smoke and sweetness. The flaming strip was pressed against her forearms, not to burn, but to cauterize, sealing pores and hardening skin against the desert's merciless air. The flash of light made her eyelids flutter, though she did not flinch. In that instant, she was both alive and transcendent, a woman suspended between earth and eternity. Next came the ritual of oils. Each drop was measured by weight on a delicately carved scale, balanced against a bead of silver. The oils themselves were a secret blend: lotus flower for purity, cedarwood for strength, and a rare resin from Nubia for endurance. The mixture glimmered in a small alabaster jar, pale gold coating its inner curves like a promise. A servant warmed a single drop between thumb and index finger, then pressed it into her wrist, behind her ear, at the hollow of her throat. She smelled it, a calm sweetness with a spine of cedar, and closed her eyes as though receiving a gift meant only for herself. While her body waited, another servant prepared the inner garments. Layers of fine linen had been cut to her exact measurements, a vest that clung like a second skin, a skirt that wrapped twice around her waist, and a sheer shawl edged with tiny seed pearls. No 2 layers could touch without a thin cloth between them. The linen itself was sacred, consecrated in a dawn ceremony at the head priest's house. The vest came first, eased over her head by 2 gentle hands, then drawn down over breast and back. The skirt followed, wrapped tight and tied with a belt of braided gold thread. Finally, the shawl was draped, one corner lying flat against her left shoulder, the rest trailing behind in a whisper of thread and pearls. Her hair remained wrapped in a narrow linen band. Now it would be freed. The servant behind her unknotted the wrap, and the hair fell in perfect coils, dark and sleek as river mud. An ivory comb glided down each section, separating and aligning strands with a soft crackle of static in the dry air. Then came the scissors, small curved bronze with blades as thin as the finest parchment. She felt each cut, a soft snip that left no fray, no split end. Locks were removed carefully, checking length with a small mirror held at her side. The discarded strands were not discarded at all, but bundled and sent to be woven into a token of memory for her mother in Thebes. With hair trimmed, the comb returned, dipping into a bowl of scented oil. The oil was drawn from crushed frankincense and myrrh, heated over a brazier until it released its resinous aroma. 2 drops were applied to each handful of hair. Then the comb made long, deliberate strokes from root to tip. The motion was almost hypnotic. The scent enveloped the room, hovering like a sacred mist. When the brushing ended, the hair was divided into 3 sections and braided with threads of gold, ebony, and carnelian. Each braid was tied with a tiny ribbon of rose-colored linen, a final flourish to a process that had begun before dawn. She rose then, stepping onto the dais where a basin of cold water had been set. Its surface reflected the carved stone walls, etched with scenes of harvest and offering. She dipped her fingers into the basin and ran them over her arms, feeling the contrast between the warmth of oil and the chill of descent. A servant bent to press a towel to her skin. Linen, soaked in the distilled juice of pomegranate leaves, absorbing any excess without disturbing the carefully oiled sheen. The final application of oil would come later, after the body scrub. In the center of the chamber stood a low, round platform covered in fine dead sea salt. The salt had been mixed with crushed mint and dried petals of red lotus, ground to a powder so fine it felt like velvet against the skin. She knelt and lowered one knee to the platform, then the other, and crouched until her entire body rested on the salt. The servants gathered around, each with a wooden bowl of salt mixture. With cupped hands, they tossed it onto her back, shoulders, and arms, then gently rubbed in circular motions, lifting away any lingering dryness, any faintest remnant of yesterday's flesh. The bath chamber windows were open just enough to let in a thread of breeze. The air tasted of salt and mint and something ancient. When the scrub ended, she climbed from the platform, and the salts were swept away by soft brushes of linen. Again, a cold water basin appeared, and she repeated the gesture. Fingers in water, blanketing her skin, sending a shiver along each muscle. Dry towels arrived, pressed and dusted with violet powder, so the scent would cling even as they absorbed moisture. Each limb was carefully dried, then a final anointment of oil, this time a blend of sesame and moringa, was applied from neck to heel. The motion was slow, meditative, and she closed her eyes, breathing in the final scent of her own making. By now, the light had shifted. The soft glow of morning had turned bright, yet the chamber remained cool, sheltered by thick walls and high windows. She stood in the center, bathed, scrubbed, oiled, dressed. Around her, the servants waited, their faces unreadable masks of service. In her hand, she held a small mirror of polished bronze, just large enough to catch a reflection. She looked into it, not to admire, but to confirm. Every line, every curve, every braid and fold was exactly as intended. A single ribbon of red linen had slipped, a slight deviation, and she lifted a hand to adjust it, touching only the ribbon, not the braid itself. A hush descended. She turned toward the door and walked, her steps soft on the stone floor. Each shoe had been crafted to fit, lined with suede and stamped with her personal emblem, the winged disc of Ra flanked by 2 cobras. As she passed, the servants fell into step behind her, carrying the remnants of the ritual. Empty bowls, used towels, the bronze knives and combs washed and placed back into velvet-lined chests. Nothing was left behind, not even a single petal. The corridor led to a small antechamber where a chaise had been set beside a low table. On the table lay the instruments of the final rite, bronze tweezers for eyebrow shaping, a bowl of crushed coal for lining the eyes, and a tiny mirror set in a handle of carved ebony. She seated herself and extended her chin. The first servant took the tweezers and, in silence, plucked each errant hair with precision. The second used a fine brush to apply kohl in a slender line along the lower eyelid, a gesture that framed her gaze like a painting. The third placed a single drop of rose water at the corner of each eye, sealing the kohl and gifting a final hint of fragrance. She rose when they finished. The antechamber doors opened onto a courtyard paved with alabaster, shaded by fig trees and jasmine vines. The air was warmer here, carrying the distant echo of clinking sandals and hushed prayers from the temple beyond. She paused, breathed in, and in that breath carried the weight of authority and ritual, a life governed by precision, by ceremony, by the power that resided in every drop of water and every stroke of brush. the doors closed softly behind her. The morning cleansing, in its every detail, had drawn to a close, and yet, for Egyptian royal women, this was only the beginning of a day, laid out like a tapestry of control, of scent, of sovereignty. Beyond these walls awaited courtiers, ambassadors, and the silent reverence of all who served. But first she would step into the throne room, her body anointed, her hair braided, her skin alive with oils and petals, a living embodiment of divine order in a world of shifting sands. And in that moment, as she crossed the threshold, her presence would speak more loudly than any decree. True power is cleanliness perfected. The day had only just begun, yet the sanctity of her person carried her forward into a ritual that spanned both body and spirit. Beyond the threshold of her private quarters, a corridor of veined alabaster led to the alabaster-paved courtyard, where a low dais stood beneath the dappled shade of date palms. Here, the ritual of the mid-morning scrub awaited, an exercise in both humility and supremacy, where every tactile sensation reinforced her dominion over flesh and element. She stepped onto the dais, bare skin still warm from the oils of dawn. Two attendants knelt before her, one holding a bowl of powdered natron mixed with finely crushed blue lotus petals, the other a bowl of warm water infused with rose hips and pale amber resin. Without a word, she extended her arms, and the first servant sprinkled the natron lotus blend along her forearms. The grains felt cool, almost whisper thin as they settled on her skin. The second pressed a damp cloth to her shoulders, the scent of rose and resin swirling upward like a sacred incense. Each motion was deliberate, the grain rubbed in tight circles from wrist to elbow, then elbow to shoulder, lifting the faintest trace of yesterday's perspiration. The water cloth passed over each newly scrubbed patch, dissolving the natron into a fine paste that clung to the skin before being rinsed away. The effect was immediate. Her skin glowed ivory, softened by both abrasion and moisture. Next came the torso. She lowered her arms and stood with regal stillness as the servants moved in synchrony, one applying the grain by hand, the other following with the cloth. The mixture traced the delicate line of her collarbones, then descended in a thin band across her chest, over the curve of her ribs, and finally to the hollow of her waist. Every ridge, every contour was treated with equal reverence. Her breath was slow, controlled, a silent metronome that matched the rhythm of scrubbing and rinsing. When the torso was done, her attendant stepped back and retrieved long-handled bronze spoons from the table beside the dais. They ladled warm water over her back and shoulders, the flow precise and measured, never too forceful, never too feeble. It cascaded down her sides, carrying away residue and leaving behind nothing but pure, damp flesh. A moment of stillness enveloped her as they dried her with towels of the softest flax, patted in gentle taps rather than rubbed. The surface of her body, arms, torso, back, had become a canvas of muted ivory, ready for the next act, the application of scented shea butter. The butter was stored in a shallow alabaster dish, kept cool beneath a silver lid engraved with the sign of Hathor. A small spatula carved from carnelian scooped a dollop, which a servant then warmed between her palms until it liquefied. She pressed her fingers at fixed intervals along the queen's spine, gliding downward in long, even strokes. The butter melted into the pores, sealing in moisture and imparting a subtle sweetness that lingered in the air like a promise. As the final traces of butter disappeared into her skin, another attendant approached bearing an ornate sistrum, the sacred rattle of Egyptian ritual. In her right hand, the queen took the instrument and shook it once, twice, letting the metallic chime resonate against the courtyard stone walls. The sound carried beyond the palace confines, a herald of her unspoken edict, that every moment of her life, even the most private, was governed by ceremony. From the courtyard, she returned to the cooling corridors of the palace's inner wing, where a chamber of mirrors awaited. The surfaces were polished bronze, each just large enough to frame a single aspect of her form: cheekbone, temple, jawline, throat. Here, the ritual of beautification commenced. A low stool had been placed before the central mirror, and she seated herself as a servant presented a pair of tweezers wrought from ebony, a hollow bone handle tipped with bronze. These tools were reserved solely for her use. They never touched another soul. She leaned forward, and the servant guided each eyebrow into a perfect arch, plucking hair, with a precision that left neither stray strand nor red mark. Her gaze remained fixed, unblinking as the work proceeded. With each hair removed, she seemed to carve her identity anew. Next, the kohl. A slender brush of pelican feather dipped into a bowl of ground galena mixed with olive oil. The servant applied the dark pigment along the upper lash line in a single fluid motion, then mirrored the gesture along the lower lashes. The line extended a fraction beyond the corner of her eye, a small flourish that suggested both watchfulness and allure. The kohl drew attention to her gaze, transforming it into a blade of shadow that could pierce the distance. When both eyes were complete, the servant pressed a wet cloth to the brush, removing any excess and ensuring that the lines were feathered at the edges, never stark. Her lips awaited the final act, a rich paste made from crushed roselle petals and a touch of honey. The red hue stained her lips in a color that spoke of pomegranate and blood, vibrant yet natural. A tiny spatula laid down the hue, and she parted her lips to allow the servant to coat the inner surface as well, a commitment to color that lasted through words and breath. The shade was more than cosmetic. It was a statement of vitality, of life's pulse beneath porcelain skin. Now, adorned with color and contour, she rose and moved toward the private garden, a narrow channel of cool marble bordered by dwarf date trees and potted papyrus. Here, the ritual of fragrance took center stage. A low table of carved ebony held dozens of small jars, each containing an essence: rosewater, jasmine attar, ambergris tincture, 1,000-year-old resin from Punt. She inhaled each scent in turn, lifting jars to her nose, eyes closed, evaluating the perfume as one might taste fine wine. Finally, she selected a blend: 2 parts jasmine, 1 part ambergris, a whisper of cedar. The attendants blended the oils in a miniature alabaster mortar, crushing a few fresh jasmine buds between the pestil's head before adding oil. The aroma rose in heady waves, full-bodied with floral sweetness and the deep rumble of ambergris. With a brush of goat hair, the final perfume was applied to pulse points, wrist, behind ears, the nape of her neck. She wandered along the channel, dipping her fingers in a basin to rinse between applications, testing the fragrance in the dappled sunlight until it sang of both flower and forest. When satisfied, she returned to the dais, the first inklings of midday heat barely perceptible beneath the latticework overhead. It was then that the manicure began, a private art form reserved for royal women. Servants brought forward trays bearing tiny pumice stones, powders of stibnite, and potions of pomegranate juice and frankincense. She seated herself on a low stool, while one attendant soaked her hands in a bowl of oil-infused water. The warm embrace of liquid loosened any remaining grime, and another servant buffed each nail with a pumice stone until the surface gleamed like polished ivory. A solution of pomegranate juice was then brushed onto each nail in thin coats, building a translucent red sheen. The color deepened with each layer until her nails glowed like embers held in sunlight. A final dab of myrrh oil sealed the enamel, and she flexed her fingers, admiring the way light played across the curves. From fingertips to shoulders, she was now complete. Hair braided, skin radiant, eyes framed, nails aflame. Yet the ritual was not over. The palace perfumer had prepared a special unguent, a cooling balm of aloe, cucumber extract, and crushed lotus root. She applied it to her face with a carved bone spatula, smoothing away any tension, any hint of the day's coming demands. The balm felt like a veil of dew, light enough to breathe through, protective enough to shield from sun and dust. As she rose, a servant presented a small wooden chest lined with velvet. Inside lay the components of her midday attire: a kerchief of sheer linen dyed with safflower, a layered skirt of white and pale blue, and a lightweight mantle embroidered with gold threads. She donned each piece with the same precision as the garments at dawn, cloth never touching bare hands, each fold secured by hidden ties, each layer resting seamlessly upon the one beneath. The safflower kerchief was tied under the chin, framing her face and catching stray braids. The mantle draped over one shoulder, its gold embroidery catching shafts of light as she moved. At last, she stepped from the chamber into the hall of audiences. Courtiers bowed, ambassadors rose, and silence fell. But for her, the weight of adornment was effortless, a second skin of ritual and refinement. Every step echoed on the alabaster floor, yet her presence was as soft as the breeze that stirred the jasmines outside. Behind her, the corridors held the remnants of her morning, empty bowls waiting to be refilled, brushes and combs that would be cleaned and stored, towels folded and sent to the drying yard. The palace hummed with life, but in her wake, there was only the memory of ritual remembered in scent and shadow. Her attendants followed at a respectful distance, each mindful of the sacred choreography that had brought her to this moment. One carried a small fan of feathers, poised to ward away any stray insects. Another bore a silver flask of rose water to refresh her perfume as needed. A third held a string of carved lapis beads, an amulet of protection against envy and ill intention. These were not accoutrements, but extensions of the ritual itself, each serving to maintain the perfection she had enacted. And so she entered the hall, the midday sun filtering through high windows, casting geometric patterns on the floor. The courtiers paused in their whispers, ambassadors stilled their gestures, and even the pillars seemed to lean toward her, as though the very architecture recognized the living sanctity of her form. She found her seat on the dais, an intricately carved throne of ebony inlaid with ivory and gold, and settled herself with the same care she had applied to every aspect of her body. The attendants withdrew, their work complete, leaving behind a tableau of power embodied in ritual. The audience commenced, but the day's central ritual, one that would extend beyond any courtly proceeding, had already been fulfilled. The ritual of self, enacted in silence and performed for no one but herself. In that moment, she was not merely a royal woman, but the living embodiment of ancient doctrine, of cosmic order made flesh. Every drop of oil, every stroke of brush, every tremor in the hushed courtyard had reaffirmed her place as both sovereign and sacred, and as she presided over petitions and proclamations, her skin still faintly scented with lotus and ambergris, her hair braided with gold, her nails alight with pomegranate hue, she was, in truth, more than a queen. She was the living axis upon which the world turned, an axis polished by hibiscus, carved by bronze, and anointed by flower and resin alike. The sun had sunk low, and the halls beyond the throne room shimmered in the golden haze of late afternoon when she withdrew to her private alcove, a narrow chamber hidden behind a carved limestone screen. Here, the next chapter of her day's sanctification would unfold. Two attendants entered, one bearing a shallow silver basin filled with water, still tinged faintly pink from hibiscus petals left over from dawn, the other cradling a tray of powders and pastes. The queen seated herself upon a low stool. Her posture was straight as the central pillar of a temple, yet her eyes remained soft, half closed as though receiving a gift of calm amid the day's duties. The first servant knelt and dipped a linen cloth into the basin, lifted it to her mistress's face, and wiped in measured sweeps from the forehead down to the chin. The cloth smelled of hibiscus but carried a hint of the day's ambergris perfume, a mingling of rituals past and present. She repeated the gesture twice, each pass more precise than the last, until her skin felt unbelievably smooth. Then, from the tray, another servant presented a paste of crushed barley grains mixed with honey and a few drops of lotus oil. With a wooden spatula, the paste was applied in narrow bands across her cheeks, temple to jawline, then along her nose ridge. The grains provided a gentle abrasion, lifting minute traces of grime, while the honey sealed moisture into her pores. She remained still, breathing in time with the servant's movements, each stroke deliberate, unhurried, as though the very notion of haste had been banished from this room. When the mask had sat for a handful of minutes, the attendants returned with fresh lotus water cloths, linen soaked overnight in aromatic blooms. They pressed the cloths over her face, then peeled them away, carrying with them both the paste and any lingering remnants of the day's labor. A final rinse came from a small ewer of water drawn from the eastern garden's fountain, water that had run cool through channels of carved stone and been blessed under the rising sun. The liquid felt like liquid marble on her cheeks, and she closed her eyes, savoring the sensation as if it were the sweetest of wines. Next came a pause, an interlude for quiet. The servants withdrew to the shadowed corners, leaving her alone with the waning light. She sat in silence, the hush broken only by the distant murmur of courtiers beyond the screen and the soft drip of water from the basin's rim. In these moments she was neither queen nor goddess, but simply woman, breathing in and out as the day turned toward evening. Yet even this breath was part of the ritual, a silent affirmation of presence, a vow that the sanctity of her body would be tended as reverently as the great statues of the gods. After this brief stillness came the re-braiding of her hair. The ivory comb returned, followed by scissors to trim any stray ends that had escaped morning care. But this was no mere maintenance, it was a transformation. The hair, now clean from the midday rinse, was divided into countless thin sections. Each section was twisted, oiled with a blend of sesame and myrrh, then woven into miniature plaits that caught the light like threads of spun gold. A second layer of braids was added, some interlaced with fine metallic wires shaped into lotus blossoms and papyrus reeds. The effect was complex yet natural, an interplay of shadow and sheen that framed her face like the petals of a celestial flower. She inclined her head slightly once, and the servants affixed the braids with pins of polished ebony tipped in bronze, each pin hidden so well that the hairstyle appeared afloat upon her scalp. With hair renewed, she turned next to her hands, a second rite of manicure more intricate than the one at midday. A servant presented a tray of oils, pomegranate seed, cedarwood, sesame. Each oil was warmed in a tiny bowl set atop a modest brazier until it shimmered like liquid fire. One drop at a time was applied to each knuckle, each finger joint, then massaged in with fingertips gloved in the softest lamb's wool. The warmth of the oil eased joint tension, imparting a subtle suppleness. The nails were buffed again with a fine pumice stone mixed with mint and lotus powder, then polished with a solution of crushed rose petals and aloe. The red sheen glowed less vivid than at midday, softer, more mature, signifying both the lingering vigor of youth and the steady wisdom of her station. Now her attendants prepared the final act of this afternoon ritual, the application of scent in layers. They first offered her a choice of incense, frankincense, myrrh, or a rare blend of both mixed with crushed juniper berries. She selected the blend, and it was burned in a small censer, the smoke spiraling upward in lazy coils. She inhaled deeply, and the courtiers beyond the alcove would swear they could feel her presence before they saw her. A second, subtler fragrance was then applied directly to her linens, a mist of distilled rose water and vervain sprayed onto her sleeves and the hems of her robes. When she stood, the air around her shimmered with the mingled scents, as if she carried a private garden in her wake. The final moments of her afternoon preparation were reserved for the feet, the unseen foundation of her power. She reclined on a low couch, and a servant gently removed the sandals she had worn for the audience. The feet were washed in warm water infused with crushed mint and dried lotus root, then dried with a towel of linen stitched with gold thread. Using a small bronze blade, the servant shaped and buffed the toenails, applying a pale coating of lotus oil mixed with a drop of crushed carnelian powder to impart a whisper of rosy hue. Finally, a cooling balm of cucumber and aloe was smoothed over the soles and heels, tempering any fatigue and renewing her step. She flexed her toes once, and the satisfaction in that simple movement was as profound as any triumph on the battlefield. Reclothed now in her private attire, a robe of pale green linen edged with gold, a kerchief dyed with indigo leaves, she rose, her body feeling both weightless and deeply grounded. The alcove doors opened onto a terrace overlooking the western gardens. There, shaded by date palms and jasmine vines heavy with blooms, she would spend the remainder of the afternoon in quiet counsel with her closest confidants. But before stepping into the sunlight, she paused at the threshold, inhaled the mingled fragrance of courtyard incense and open air, and allowed herself a moment of private triumph. In every detail, every grain of salt, every drop of oil, every petal-infused cloth, she had asserted sovereignty over her flesh, and in that assertion lay the true, unspoken power of Egyptian royal women. That mastery of the self is mastery of the world itself. The sun had dipped below the western horizon, and the palace corridors took on the muted glow of oil lamps set into wall brackets of bronze and alabaster. Shadows danced along the carved reliefs of lotus and papyrus, lending the halls a quiet intimacy. In her private chamber, sealed by heavy curtains of dyed linen, the queen prepared for the final sequence of her day's sanctification. This was the ritual of evening, a ritual not merely of cleansing but of transition, a passage from the duties of sovereignty into the sanctuary of rest. A servant entered bearing a shallow basin of water, still warm from heated stones infused with crushed jasmine petals and a single drop of night-blooming cereus essence. The queen sat on a low stool, her posture composed yet relaxed, eyes unfocused, as though listening to the soft drip of water echoing from a distant fountain. The servant dipped a strip of fine linen into the bowl, and, beginning at the crown of the head, wiped down the nape of her neck in a single long stroke. The scent of cereus, delicate and fleeting, rose around her, a whisper of blossoms that bloomed only under the moon. Another servant took a second strip and continued the ritual down her shoulders, across her clavicles and along the length of her arms, each motion measured, deliberate. When the top half of her body was gently cleansed, the queen rose and stepped onto a marble dais where a low marble basin waited. Lamplight shimmered off its surface, revealing the pale green hue of water left from the day's herbal infusion. Mint, hyssop, and desert thyme. She lowered herself into the bath, seating her calves and thighs until only her shoulders and head remained above the water. A servant ladled warm water over her, working from shoulder to wrist, then thigh to ankle, ensuring no corner of skin remained untouched. The mingled scents of medicinal herbs filled the chamber, imbuing the air with both tranquility and quiet vigilance. After a few minutes of stillness, the queen rose and allowed the basin to drain, the water slipping away with a soft sigh. She stepped onto a towel of mustard-hued linen woven with stylized feather motifs, patting her skin dry in gentle taps. Next came the evening application of oils and salves, a complex blend designed not only to moisturize but to lull body and mind toward sleep. A servant brought forth an alabaster jar containing a balm of sesame, marjoram, and crushed moonflower petals. The queen scooped a small portion with an ivory spatula and warmed it between her palms until it glowed. Beginning at her feet, she pressed the balm into the soles, massaging arches and heels, then moved upward to calves, thighs, hips, and abdomen, each stroke slow, circulatory, coaxing warmth and comfort. Her back received extra care. A servant poured 2 drops of the same balm onto long-gloved fingertips and pressed them along the length of her spine, following the natural curve of a vertebrae as though tracing the path from earth to sky. She inhaled the faint sweetness of moonflower, a narcotic hint of night's embrace, letting the balm's weight settle her. The arms, chest, and shoulders were anointed next, as was the neck, where a drop of pure frankincense oil was placed behind each ear. The queen closed her eyes at that final touch, savoring the resinous tension it eased from her temples. Clothing for rest awaited, a simple shift of pale linen, cut loose to allow air to caress her skin. 2 attendants unfolded the garment and lowered it over her head, smoothing the fabric down her back and shoulders. Then they tied the waist with a slender cord of braided papyrus fiber. Nothing elaborate. This was the uniform of night, meant to be both soothing and respectful of her station. A second layer, a light robe of cream-colored wool, was draped over her shoulders and secured with a single agate clasp carved to resemble a closed lotus bud. With her body prepared for repose, the queen turned to her hair. A small stool beside the low couch held an ebony comb, a bowl of warm water, and a cloth soaked in a calming infusion of chamomile and violet. The servant dipped the comb in water, then gently worked through the braids created at midday and afternoon, loosening their intricate patterns. As each braid unraveled, the hair fell in soft coils to her shoulders, releasing the tension of pins and wires. The queen reached up to stroke a lock of hair, its warmth still holding the day's scents. Now came the ritual of nightly hair oil, 2 drops of sesame oil warmed between palms, then pressed at the roots, fingers massaging scalp in slow, heartbeat tempo. The motion coaxed out any remaining impurities and soothed the day's exertions. She leaned back, eyes drifting closed as the servant continued until every strand, from crown to nape, had received the gentle treatment. Finally, her hair was gathered at the nape and tied loosely with a ribbon of natural flax, leaving a single length trailing down her back. The next element was private, the ritual of intimate care, a practice known only to royal women and their most trusted attendants. A second basin, smaller, deeper, and set into a niche of the chamber, contained a blend of warm water, hibiscus petals, and pomegranate leaf distillate. The queen knelt before it, the servant offering a linen cloth for modesty. Slowly, deliberately, she washed herself where no other eyes ever fell, the petals brushing soft as whispers across the most sensitive skin. The servant assisted only when called upon, her touch respectful, her eyes averted. When the cleansing was complete, the queen rose and allowed the water to drain into a trough lined with river stones, where it would nourish the palace gardens under the cover of night. Having cleansed every surface, every secret curve of her body, the queen then turned to the final act of preparation, the fragrance of dreams. A small censer of powdered myrrh was lit, the smoke curling around her like a protective shroud. She inhaled deeply, the resin's sacred smoke filling her lungs, clearing her mind of council murmurs and courtly intrigue. A servant waved the censer around her, ensuring the smoke reached both front and back, left and right, sealing her in a circle of scent as invisible as moonlight. As the smoke dissipated, she sat on the low couch, a folded linen shawl behind her back. Her attendants withdrew, leaving only one, the night custodian, whose duty was to oversee the final moments before the queen retired. The custodian knelt and placed a small bronze mirror in the queen's hand. The queen gazed into it, not to admire but to acknowledge, the traces of her day's transformation visible only in the faint glow of oil still clinging to her skin, in the softened curve of her hair, in the serene set of her eyes. She nodded once, and the custodian rose to fetch the last element, the sleep amulet. From the folds of the custodian's robe, she drew a string of smooth carnelian beads, each bead painted with a tiny symbol: the eye of Horus, the wings of Hathor, the lotus, the papyrus. The queen draped the amulet over her shoulders like a necklace, the beads resting against her chest. It was said to ward off nightmares and ensure peaceful slumber. Whether its power lay in magic or in the comfort of ritual, the queen believed it was essential. A single lamp remained lit, the rest had been extinguished, to cast a pool of golden light around her. She lay back, trailing one hand across the fabric of her shift, feeling its cool embrace. The carnelian amulet lay heavy against her skin, and she pressed it once as if sealing a promise. The custodian stepped back, bowed, and closed the curtains, sealing the chamber from the world beyond. In the quiet that followed, the only sounds were the distant murmur of palace guards and the occasional drip of water from the stone eaves. The queen's breath slowed, matching the rhythm of the night's gentle pulse. Luna's glow filtered through the small lattice window overhead, painting lines of silver across the walls and floor. The scent of myrrh and night-blooming cereus lingered, mingling with the residual hints of jasmine and lotus. As she drifted toward sleep, her mind reviewed the day's ministrations. Every bronze blade's whisper against skin, every petal's fleeting brush, every drop of oil warmed in patient palms. Each had been an act of sovereignty, asserting control over self at the threshold of private and public life. With each ritual completed, she had reaffirmed her place not only as a queen of mortals, but as an earthly reflection of divine order. Within the folds of her dreams, she walked through the palace gardens, barefoot on marble paths, roses and night jasmines brushing her ankles. The scent of her own making guided her, a path lit by lanterns carved in the shape of lotus blossoms. Servants bowed at the edges of her vision, their faces serene, hands empty, knowing her presence alone was power enough. Statues of Isis and Hathor lined the way, their stone eyes alive with silent blessing. And as sleep claimed her, the final ritual unfolded, the release of the self into rest, the cleansing, the anointing, the dressing, the braiding, the combing, the scent. Each was a thread in a tapestry woven by her own hand. In surrendering to sleep, she entrusted her perfected form to the night's stillness, confident that come dawn, the cycle would begin anew. The servants awaiting, the bowls prepared, the oils measured, the lamps polished, the petals crushed, the secret chambers breathing with ritual. Thus ended the day of the Egyptian royal woman, a day defined by the care of every inch of flesh, every filament of hair, every scattered petal, every grain of salt. And in that endless loop of purification and adornment lay the essence of her rule, that true power resides not only in decrees and gold, but in mastery of one's own body, tended with devotion and ceremony. In the hush before the final twilight of sleep, she reigned supreme over herself, a sovereign cloaked in myrrh, smoke, and moonlit petals, anointed by lotus and pomegranate, wrapped in linen consecrated by dawn's first light, and therein found the deepest peace of all. The chamber lay silent except for the slow tick of a carved ivory clock, a reminder that even in a world without running water, time itself was precious. A single lantern glowed on the polished rosewood table, its flame sheltered by translucent silk panels painted with dragons. Along its edges lay the implements of ritual cleanliness, powdered jasmine, bundles of fragrant herbs, ivory combs, and a small lacquer box of sorghum stalk fibers. At the far end, the Empress reclined on a low platform bed dressed in layers of diaphanous silk, her eyes half closed, fingers tracing the carved phoenix etched into the bed's frame. Tonight, she would undertake this sacred ceremony of self-purification, an art refined over centuries in the Forbidden City, all without a single drop of water. Two palace maids entered on silent feet. Their sleeves were bound close to their wrists. Their hair, plaited and pinned, bore no ornament that might catch on silks. In their hands they carried the first step of the ritual, a bundle of dried osmanthus flowers wrapped in fine linen. The bundle gave off a soft, honeyed fragrance. The Empress inhaled deeply, as though drawing strength from the blossom's scent alone. The maid knelt and held the osmanthus bundle before her, then, with a long, slow sweep, brushed it along the Empress's forehead. No pressure, only the lightest of touches, as if a breeze played across her skin. The petals whispered across brow and temples, dissolving the dust of courtly duties that clung like a thin film. Next came the face. A second maid stepped forward with a silk cloth, its fibers spun with crushed pearl powder, and a whisper of mica for subtle glow. She unfolded the cloth and draped it over the Empress's cheeks. The Empress lifted one hand, pale as moonlight, and guided its edge from inner brow to outer temple. The maid followed, folding the cloth and repeating the sweep, each pass more precise than the last until every crease, every pore felt cleansed. She folded the cloth into 6 perfect layers and set it aside. Unused layers would return to the care of the imperial apothecary, never to touch another person. A third maid knelt and presented a shallow celadon bowl containing a paste of powdered rice, ground sandalwood, and crushed angelica root. The paste was densely fragrant, earthy and sweet. With an ivory spatula, she applied a thin ribbon across the ridge of the Empress's nose, then brushed upward along the cheekbones, over the jawline, and beneath the chin. The Empress exhaled as the paste settled, soft grains anchoring themselves to her skin. The maids waited, allowing the paste to absorb oils and impurities. In the silence, the lantern's flame flickered, and the shadows on the paneled walls rippled like living spirits. After several heartbeats, the maids returned. One held a fresh, silk-encased bundle of dried chrysanthemum petals. The petals, bleached pale as moonflowers, brushed away the rice-sandalwood mixture in tiny flurries. Each sweep removed the paste along with whatever residue had collected in its claws, traces of sweat from midday audiences, the faintest hint of rouge from pose and polish. When the final sweep was complete, the Empress's skin gleamed softly like polished jade. She raised her hand then, and the first maid offered her a slender brush, carved of boxwood, its bristles made from fine mink hair. Into this she tapped a pinch of powdered white bamboo ash, a substance prized for its gentle exfoliation and absorbent properties. With closed eyes, the Empress guided the brush along her arms, first the right, then the left, moving from wrist to elbow in deliberate strokes. The ash brushed away the invisible residue of the day, the dry stickiness of silk folds, the unseen cling of floral scents left on her skin. The movement echoed like a silent hymn, each sweep a silent utterance of reverence for the body it cleansed. Once the arms had been treated, the Empress sat upright. The night's breeze drifted through the carved lattice window, carrying the distant chants of temple priests beyond the palace walls. A fourth maid approached, carrying a small porcelain jar of charcoal-infused talc. The Empress dipped 2 fingers into the talc, then patted them against her throat, the base of her neck, and the nape. The powdered charcoal absorbed moisture and balanced the skin's natural oils. She paused, listening to the hiss of silk curtains as they moved. No one spoke. No one dared break the hush of such solemn purpose. Next was the torso. A low table beside the bed held bundles of cotton pads woven with sorghum fibers, each pad as soft as a petal. Into these the maids pressed a paste of saffron and crushed jade powder, a bright yellow tinged with a translucent sparkle. One by one, they pressed the pads to the Empress's chest, moving outward in symmetrical patterns, from sternum to shoulder, shoulder to waist, waist to hips, closing the loop back at the sternum. Each pad was pressed, lifted, and replaced with another. No pad was ever reused in the same spot. The jade powder cooled the skin, the saffron soothed. The combination left no trace but comfort. When the torso was complete, the Empress lay back, reclining with regal ease. The maids withdrew the pads, gathered them, and left the chamber to be cleansed and re-dyed in the imperial laundries. A new maid entered, a specialist trained in the ritual of hair adornments. In her hand she held a slender tortoiseshell comb and a vial of powdered camellia seed. A few grains of camellia powder were poured into the comb's teeth. Then, as though brushing silk threads, she began to comb the Empress's hair, each stroke aligning every strand, distributing the powder evenly from roots to tips. The camellia absorbed oils and impurities, leaving hair supple and faintly scented of green tea. As the comb moved through the tresses, the Empress sensed the ritual's second breath, a renewal of her identity, renewed moment by moment, stroke by stroke. When the final pass was made, the maid bound a fresh length of silk ribbon dyed with cinnabar red, her dynastic color, around the Empress's braid. The knot was folded into the hair's weave so that only a hint of scarlet peeked through the dark waves. Another light slipped through the window, a single star blinking high above. The Empress rose from the bed, her body cleansed, her skin balanced, her hair realigned. A circle of rosewood stools stood before a gilded folding screen, painted with cranes in flight. She seated herself on the center stool, and the maids formed a semicircle around her. The final act of the evening's purification began, the anointment of fragrance. From a carved jade box they drew a swatch of silk embroidered with lotus blossoms. On it they sprinkled a blend of musk, ambergris, and camphor, scents that, together, evoked sacred incense and hearth fires. The Empress inclined forward and pressed the swatch to her palms, wrists, and the hollow of her throat. Each contact transferred a breath of perfume, an invisible seal of sanctity. She inhaled gently, and the fragrance settled beneath her skin, a protective veil against the desert chill of night. At last, the maid stepped back. The Empress stood, each movement measured, as much a part of the ceremony as the cleansing that had come before. She draped herself in a robe of gauzy silk scented with osmanthus water, its edges embroidered in silver thread. The fabric floated around her like morning mist. A final glance and a hand mirror of polished bronze confirmed the transformation. Luminous skin, hair smooth as riverstone, fragrance lingering like memory. She left the chamber then, walking barefoot to the sleeping pavilion beyond the garden courtyard, her path lit by lanterns carved in the shape of lotus buds. The courtyard pools mirrored her passage, reflecting lantern light and the silhouette of her flowing robes. Servants stood at attention on either side, their heads bent, eyes cast downward. As she passed, the air seemed to hum with respect for the invisible ritual she carried with her. Inside the pavilion, she reclined on a silk-lined bed draped with gauze. Two attendants knelt by her side, tucking silk quilts around her ankles and placing a crescent moon pillow beneath her head. The final piece of the ritual awaited, the sleep amulet. A slender jade pendant carved with the character for tranquility lay on a lacquered tray. The Empress reached for it and traced its curves with a fingertip. She pressed it to her heart, and the attendants fastened it around her neck on a cord of silk, dyed the palest blue. A single lantern remained lit, its flame soft and steady, while all others were extinguished. The pavilion fell into velvet darkness, save for the moonlight that filtered through the lattice. The Empress closed her eyes, breathing in the unconscious power of rituals performed without water. The powders, the pastes, the silks, the scents. In that silence, she felt the pulse of generations, women who had perfected the art of cleanliness, without a well, without a bath, without a single drop. They had learned that purity could be achieved through touch, through scent, through texture, and that the body, once honored in this way, became a sanctuary unto itself. And so, she slept, wrapped in layers of ritual care, her skin still humming with the memory of jasmine and chrysanthemum, her hair carrying the faintest trace of camellia, her breath softened by the lotus-scented air. Outside, the palace breathed with the night, the distant murmur of guards, the soft rustle of silk curtains, the hush of stone corridors cooling under the moon. Within, the Empress dreamt of a realm where water was but one element among many, and where the art of self-purification was as precious as any jewel at her girdle. In that dream, she walked through fields of white lotus, her footsteps forging a path of petals, each one brushing against her skin like the gentlest of reminders. True power lies in the mastery of ritual, in the devotion to self, and in the knowledge that even without water, a queen may remain forever immaculate. She rose before the midday sun had reached its zenith, the eastern courtyard's carved marble tiles still cool under her bare feet. No water would greet her skin today. Instead, she would rely on the tools of dry purification. Powders, oils, fabrics, and ritual implements honed through centuries of palace tradition. At the threshold of her inner chamber stood a low black lacquer table, its surface arranged with precision. Porcelain jars of finely sieved camellia seed powder, trays of medicinal clay from the Yellow River basin, bundles of dried herbs bound in silk, and a shallow earthenware bowl filled with lukewarm oil infused with bergamot and ginger. The Empress paused to breathe in the fragrance, citrus bright, spice warm, then stepped forward as her attendants knelt in silent formation. First came the clay application. A maid scooped a tablespoon of pale green clay with an ivory spatula and placed it in a small bronze bowl. She added a pinch of powdered chrysanthemum and a scattering of ground white sandalwood, then mixed them into a paste with a single drop of the bergamot ginger oil. The Empress lifted her chin slightly, eyes drifting closed, and the maid swept the paste across her forehead in a wide, deliberate stroke. The clay felt cool against her skin, drawing out invisible impurities in a single pull. With synchronized grace, the other maid applied the mixture along her cheekbones, across the bridge of her nose, and along her jawline. Each movement was a silent benediction, pressing healing botanicals into her pores in precisely measured quantities. As the clay began to dry, tightening gently across her skin, the Empress sat perfectly still, her breath slow and controlled. The attendants stood back, the room settling into a hush, broken only by the soft hiss of drying clay. Then, at a signal known only to them, both maids knelt again and offered silk-wrapped bundles of bamboo charcoal-infused talc. She reached for one, unwrapped the silk, and dusted the powder over the clay mask. The talc gripped the drying paste, lifting it away with every microscopic grain. After a count of 30 heartbeats, the attendants returned with linen cloth steeped in gossamer threads of tallow and camellia oil. With long, slow sweeps, they removed the clay in perfect arcs, revealing skin that gleamed like burnished jade beneath the lantern light. Next was the midday hair renewal. A third attendant knelt with a tortoiseshell comb and a porcelain dish containing powdered rice bran mixed with crushed sakura petals. The Empress leaned forward slightly as the comb passed through each section of her hair, distributing the rice bran blend from roots to ends. The powder absorbed oils and kept strands luminous without grease, while the delicate floral note of sakura drifted like a spring breeze through the chamber. When the comb had traveled each hidden fold and every braid had been teased apart, the maid gathered the loose strands and braided them anew, weaving in slender strips of silk dyed with tea-stained brown. The result was a low, intricate crown at the nape of her neck, both artful and purposeful, preserving the shape while allowing air to caress her scalp. With hair secure, the Empress crossed to a low settee by the wall, upon which sat a lacquer tray bearing jade gua sha stones and porcelain spoons of warmed sesame and apricot kernel oil. She reclined slightly, and a fourth attendant warmed the oils in her palms before gliding them across the Empress's temples, along the hollows beneath her cheekbones and over her throat. The friction of the warmed oil coaxed tension from her muscles, preparing her face for the gua sha massage to follow. The attendant held a flat jade stone at an angle of 30 degrees and pressed it into her skin, tracing graceful lines from center to periphery, from chin to ear, from nose to temple, from brow to hairline. The stone's coolness against the warmed oil created a dance of thermal contrast that awakened circulation and etched a subtle contour into her features. Each stroke ended in a soft sigh as the Empress exhaled, yielding to the ritual's restorative rhythm. When the gua sha was complete, a fifth attendant knelt with small paper strips treated with a scented resin tincture, ambergris, sandalwood, and a trace of osmanthus. The strips, narrower than a finger, were pressed across the Empress's eyelids and beneath her lashes, securing the delicate skin and imparting a faint shimmer when the light touched her gaze. It was said that the resin's warmth soothed the eyes and prevented dryness, a common ailment in the dry palace halls. The Empress blinked once, confirming that the strips had settled without discomfort. Now came the purification of the limbs. The Empress stood and extended her arms. 2 attendants bore porcelain bowls filled with a paste of rice flour and powdered honeysuckle flowers. The paste, creamy and fragrant, was spread along her forearms and calves, then gently massaged in circular motions with bundles of silken thread stripped from the fibers of red flax. The friction of thread against paste lifted dead skin and invisible dust, while the honeysuckle's natural astringency tightened her pores. The attendants moved from wrist to elbow, ankle to knee, each section treated in equal measure. When the scrubbing ended, they brushed away residue with soft goat hair brushes, revealing arms and legs that seemed to glow under the soft lantern light. Reclothed now in a loose robe of safflower-dyed linen, light enough to allow the skin to breathe yet heavy enough to cloak her form, the Empress progressed to the midday scent ceremony. In the center of the chamber lay a circular platform of white marble. At its heart burned a small censer filled with powdered juniper and sweetgrass. The attendants guided her to stand upon the platform, then waved long feathers of barn owl and hawk across her body. The smoke curled around her like a living garment, settling into the folds of her robe and trailing into her hair. Each brush of feather was an invocation of purity, each wisp of smoke a protective veil against invisible ills. When the feathers were stowed away, the attendants presented a swatch of silk embroidered with lotus and bamboo motifs. Upon it, they sprinkled a final blend of orris root and dried mandarin peel. The Empress pressed the swatch to her ears, her chest, her abdomen, wherever bare skin peeked beneath her robes, so that her scent would linger as an invisible signature. Following fragrance was the subtle art of midday decorum. A lacquered box of embroidered silk patches was opened, a collection of small fabric pieces infused with aromatic oils, vetiver, cedar, and a pinch of myrrh. Each patch, folded into a tiny square, was slipped between the folds of her robe, one at the nape of the neck, another at the bend of the elbow, a third at the small of her back. These discreet sachets served as built-in refreshers, releasing scent gradually throughout the afternoon's audiences. The Empress tested each patch with a fingertip, ensuring it did not press too tightly against her skin. The final act before she took her seat for the midday court, the polishing of her nails. A 6th attendant knelt with trays of emery stones and powders of crushed pomegranate seeds and lacquer. The Empress extended her hands. Each nail was buffed with emery until smooth, then the pomegranate powder was applied in thin layers, building a semi-opaque red that glowed softly yet looked natural. Between coats, a brush of lacquer sealed the color and protected the nail's surface. When the process concluded, her fingers gleamed as though dusted with morning light. With her person thus perfected, skin luminous, hair orderly, nails aglow, scent balanced, the Empress crossed the threshold to the hall of courtiers. The corridors whispered as her soft slippers touched the floor. Servants and officials bowed as she passed, their eyes respectful, their voices hushed. In the hall, she took her place upon the elevated dais, the midday light filtering through colored silks above, casting a mosaic of jade, amber, and rose across her safflower robes. Yet this ritual of presentation was but the culmination of the dry purification cycle. As she listened to supplications and weighed appeals, she felt the residual warmth of clay against her cheeks, the faint pressure of silk sachets against her back, the aroma of honeysuckle and ambergris drifting through the air. Each element, applied without a single drop of water, had bound her to the centuries of empresses who came before, women who had mastered the alchemy of skin and scent, who had learned that true cleanliness could be achieved through touch, powder, and ceremony alone. When the audience concluded, she withdrew to her private alcove once more. There, a final sequence awaited, the midday revival before the afternoon's duties. The attendants returned with polished jade rollers, smooth, elongated stones carved to curve beneath the jawline and along the brow. They applied them with the same cooled sesame apricot oil used earlier, tracing from chin to ear, forehead to hairline, each pass measured. The rollers relieved any swelling, sharpened the features, and renewed circulation, a therapeutic interlude before the afternoon's labors. Lastly, they retrieved a set of paper strips soaked in a tonic of ginseng root and chrysanthemum flower. The Empress guided her own hands, pressing the strips along the length of her arms and down her legs. Each strip absorbed oils and pigments left from the earlier pastes, then was respectfully discarded. The process left her skin feeling impossibly light, as though velvet and vapor had merged beneath her robes. Thus ended the second part of her day, a tapestry of dry purification spanning clay masks, talc dusting, powder combing, oil massages, gua sha, feather smoke, scented sachets, and the quiet majesty of ritual. No water had touched her skin, yet she was as clean and renewed as if she had bathed in a mountain spring. And as she prepared to face the afternoon's audiences, she carried within her the deep serenity of one who knows that mastery of self is the greatest dominion of all. The afternoon sun slanted through the latticed windows of the inner palace, splintering light into geometric patterns of gold and shadow across the polished rosewood floors. The Empress rose from her dais, every movement deliberate, as though the palace itself bent to accommodate her passage. Her safflower-dyed robes trailed behind her in a whisper, brushing the carved thresholds of each chamber. Two maids followed, bearing lacquered trays. One carried a bundle of finely spun silk scarves infused with powdered orris root and clove. The other held porcelain dishes of scented dust and balms. No drop of water would grace her skin today, yet every inch of her forms would be renewed by dry ceremony. They arrived at the Hall of Ivory Screens, a secluded room hung with panels depicting cranes in flight in bamboo groves. Here, the ritual of the afternoon refresh began. The first maid knelt and unfolded a scarf the color of autumn dawn, its weave threaded through with silver. She draped it over the Empress's shoulders, the ends falling like quiet tears at her back. With gloved fingertips, she smoothed the silk against the Empress's neck, absorbing the faint sheen of earlier oils. The scarf was then removed and set aside to be aired and reinfused. Every fiber sacred, every fold consecrated. Next, the second maid presented a porcelain dish of rice flour, blended with crushed mint leaves and a dusting of ground camellia seeds. The Empress extended her right hand, palm upward, allowing the maid to sift the powder through a fine bronze sieve, letting it settle like snow upon her fingers, wrist, and forearm. A slender brush of camel hair then swept the dust in perfect circles, lifting away invisible particles and imparting a cool, verdant freshness. The same dance was repeated on her left arm and across her shoulders. The powder clung to her skin like a second epidermis, absorbing oils and revitalizing pores until the skin beneath seemed luminous. After the dusting came the leather-bound fan, a ritual instrument as much as a cooling device. Crafted from sandalwood ribs and mounted with mother-of-pearl panels painted with peonies, it was kept on a pedestal guarded by eunuchs. The Empress extended her right hand and a eunuch knelt to present the fan. With a single fluid motion, he opened it. Its soft rustle was the signal for the next phase, fragrancing. A small ivory vial was uncorked, releasing the sweet, smoky scent of tobacco orchid and chrysanthemum. The air held the perfume for a heartbeat before the fan's breeze dispersed it, wafting the aroma in languid waves across the Empress's face and hair. No voice broke the hush. Even the courtyard birds seemed to fall silent in reverence. The Empress then moved to a low marble table set beside a bronze brazier. Upon it lay jade rollers and gua sha stones already used in the morning, but prepared anew. The attendants applied a paste of powdered white lotus and ground pearl to her temples and cheekbones, then followed with the jade roller, tracing lines of rejuvenation from the jaw toward the hairline, from brow to temple. The stone's coolness contrasted with the warmth of the paste, awakening the skin as though it had woken from a dream. Each pass coaxed away tension, sharpening her features into reliefs of perfection. A hush settled as she reclined on a silken cushion. One maid knelt behind her, placing a second ivory vial to the Empress's nose, a blend of bergamot and crushed coriander seed. The fragrance deepened the earlier notes of orchid, layering scents like petals atop petals. This was not mere indulgence, but a calculated invocation of alertness. The subtle spices urged clarity of mind. The floral notes soothed the spirit. For a moment, she inhaled so deeply that the ornate hairpins, small lotus blossoms of carved jade and gold, caught the light and flickered at her temples. Her hair, braided in the morning into a low, intricate crown, now required a touch of afternoon grace. A slender tortoiseshell comb, dusted with rice bran powder, moved through her tresses, releasing any clinging dust of courtly airs. The comb's teeth separated each braid, and two attendants worked in tandem, one re-braiding loose sections into 3 thick plaits, the other weaving in strands of spun gold silk. The golden threads glinted in the slanting light, transforming her hair into a living tapestry. When the final plait was done, a single silk ribbon dyed with safflower and indigo was tied at the nape, its knot hidden so that only a faint shimmer of color peeked through the coils. The Empress rose to her feet, ankles bare against silk slippers lined with swift. At a bench of carved rosewood, a servant knelt with a shallow porcelain dish of powdered white camellia seeds mixed with ground lotus root. The Empress extended her right foot, and the servant tapped the powder around her heel, arch, and toes, then buffed gently with a bundle of cotton ramie threads. Each loop of thread lifted away residual moisture and balanced the natural oils underfoot. The same ceremony was performed on her left foot. When both feet felt restored, another attendant presented fine silk socks embroidered with silver plum blossoms. The Empress slid them on, flexing her toes to test their softness. Her hands, already dusted, now required a final flourish. Seated once more on a low stool, she extended her fingers. A maid brought forward an emery stone rubbed with a paste of pomegranate seeds and frankincense. With a single, practiced motion, she buffed each nail, then applied a thin coat of crushed peach shell lacquer, building a translucent blush that caught the light like the first flush of dawn. The nails gleamed, a testament to her station, yes, but also to the meticulous care invested in every gesture. With body and limbs renewed, the Empress made her way to the pavilion of whispering bamboos, an enclosed courtyard where the afternoon breeze carried the susurration of leaves. Here, a low stone pool of jade-tinted marble awaited, not for bathing, but for ritual immersion of the senses. The air above the pool shimmered with floating incense coils, one of powdered sandalwood, another of spiced cedar. The Empress approached and knelt at the edge, fingertips grazing the scented smoke as it drifted downward. She closed her eyes and let the mingled aromas, orchid, bergamot, mint, cedar, settle into her memory. No cloth touched her skin, no water wetted her form. Instead, she drank in fragrance as one might sip a restorative tea. After several breaths, she stood and faced the central pavilion. There, a narrow channel of white pebbles led to a dais of polished jade. On it rested a small lacquered chest. The Empress unlocked it herself, a privilege reserved for the sovereign alone, and withdrew a simple comb of carved boxwood infused with powdered camphor. She ran it once through her hair, smoothing stray strands and imparting the herbal sharpness of camphor into each braid. Then she replaced the comb and closed the chest, the click of its latch echoing like a final note in a symphony. The final act of the afternoon's purification was the application of protective amulets and sprays. 2 eunuchs knelt, one on each side, holding silk sachets embroidered with the characters for health and clarity. The sachets contained a mixture of angelica root, juniper berries, and white peony petals. The Empress pressed each sachet to her temples, her throat, and the hollow at the base of her skull. The subtle weight of the sachets grounded her, a tactile reminder of her connection to earth and spirit alike. A pair of lacquered vessels, long-necked and slender, were then uncorked. One held a spray of distilled mandarin peel, the other a mist of green tea extract. The Empress raised her hands, palms together, and the eunuchs misted the air above and around her head. The droplets, invisible in the still air, clung to the silk of her robe and the fine hairs at her temples, releasing a fleeting burst of citrus or tea scent whenever she moved. This mist formed an invisible aura, a personal atmosphere of refinement. As the final spritz settled, the Empress stepped down from the dais, her form a living tableau of ritual completeness, skin powdered and balanced, hair braided and camphored, nails lacquered, feet soothed, limbs refreshed, senses imbued with a tapestry of scents. She walked out of the pavilion of whispering bamboos and into the hall of jade lions, where the late afternoon audience awaited. Courtiers and petitioners paused in their gestures of respect, sensing the quiet authority that radiated from her every pore. In the hush that fell, she took her throne, a chair carved from a single block of white jade, its sculpted lions guarding both sides. As the supplicants stepped forward, their voices barely above whispers, the Empress regarded them with a measured calm. The rituals of the afternoon had reinforced more than her cleanliness. They had fortified her presence, honing her mind and body into instruments of sovereignty. Each touch of powder, each stroke of comb, each breath of incense had been an act of reclamation, a sovereign reclaiming her flesh from the desert's dust, from the palace's stagnation, from the march of endless audiences. And as the sun dipped lower, turning the screens behind her golden, she presided over the hall with a quiet power that needed no declaration. In that moment, her self-purification, from dawn's osmanthus to midday's clay and afternoon's powders, culminated not in vanity, but in perfect readiness, for every petition, every counsel, every silent glance that carried more weight than words. For a Chinese empress, cleanliness without water was not mere habit. It was a living doctrine, woven into the rhythm of court life and etched into the very bones of her rule. The evening light settled over the palace like a silk veil, turning stone to amber and bronze to flame. Shadows grew long across the lacquered halls, and with them came the Empress's final ritual of the day, a slow retreat from the demands of the world and a return into stillness. In this sacred hour, she would not bathe, nor would a single drop of water touch her skin, but her body would be unburdened of the day's layers, of incense and powder, of ceremonial oils and scented dusts. What remained would be the purified core of her presence, undisturbed by water, sustained by touchless cleansing. The Empress stepped into the hall of silent peonies, where a twilight's hush had already overtaken the marble corridors. This chamber, deep within the palace heart, was lit only by the warm flicker of sesame oil lamps and the dim blue glow of mica lanterns. Her shadow followed her like an obedient ghost. Attendants, already kneeling, awaited her entrance. They had prepared the space precisely, mats of pressed reed, pillows of duck feather wrapped in indigo-dyed linen, and in the center, a ceremonial couch carved from white cypress and draped in sheer silk gauze. The first act of night's ritual began with disrobing, not of nudity, but of ceremony. A maid approached and untied the day's final knot, the safflower indigo ribbon threaded through the Empress's hair. The braids were gently unraveled, the gold silk threads pulled free, and the natural coils of her black hair allowed to fall like ink across her shoulders. A second maid, with a wide-toothed comb carved from polished buffalo horn, ran it slowly through the strands, coaxing them into openness, letting them breathe. As she worked, she sprinkled a powdered preparation of ground hibiscus bark and fine cedar onto the scalp. An herbal mix meant not to clean, but to calm, to cool the fever of court. Once the last strand of hair had been loosened and dusted, the Empress reclined on the cypress couch, arms resting gently along her sides. A eunuch stepped forward, holding a shallow tray lined with mulberry paper. Upon it were tiny envelopes, no larger than a fingernail, each containing a precise pinch of nightfall balm, a powdered blend of crushed magnolia petals, clove ash, powdered jade, and roasted fennel seed. One by one, the envelopes were opened, and the contents lightly tapped onto her pulse points, her wrists, inner elbows, beneath the chin, behind the ears. Another attendant followed with a puff of soft cotton and dabbed the powders gently into the skin. There was no scent, only the subtle weight of preparation, like dreams pressed into the flesh. Next came the cleansing of the eyes. A silken strip steeped in a cooled infusion of chrysanthemum and wolfberry dust was unrolled and held before her. The Empress closed her eyes, and the strip was gently placed across her brow and lids, allowing the powdered herbs to draw out the irritants of incense, sunlight, and formality. After several breaths, the strip was removed, and a light fan, one made of woven silk and eagle feather, was waved across her face to dry the skin and settle the herb's trace particles into the corners of her lashes. Her eyes fluttered open, moist and soothed, gleaming softly in the lantern glow. Then came the ritual of release. The Empress extended her hands and the maids removed her lacquered slippers, revealing feet still dusted with the morning's camellia and lotus powder. They worked with soft cotton swatches, rubbed with pine resin and rice chaff, carefully lifting the remaining traces of scent and sweat from heel to toe. Not a single drop of water was needed. Friction and fine powder drew out the impurities, leaving her skin softened, dry, and warm. As they worked, they murmured the sacred litany of descending, from duty to stillness, from light to dusk, from outside to within. Her hands were next. The lacquer, applied at midday, was now dulled by ceremony. Using a silk pad coated with a paste of vinegar crystal and finely crushed pearl, an attendant gently erased the peach-tinted sheen from each nail. The act was slow and rhythmic, like the ebbing of tide. Once bare, the Empress's fingertips were pressed lightly into a dish of powdered plum blossom bark, its bitter dust absorbing the last traces of public presence, returning her hands to silence. She rose and moved to the twilight screen, a standing partition painted with cranes in twilight flight, and turned her back to it. There, she stood still while two attendants unfastened the inner robe, the last formal garment of the day. They peeled it back carefully, layer by layer, folding each piece into perfect squares and setting it into a lacquered chest. Beneath, she wore only a gauze-thin inner shift, barely more than a whisper against her skin. Through its translucent folds, the powders and herbal shadows on her body remained visible, like inscriptions hidden within paper. With her robe set aside, the Empress seated herself before the dusk mirror, a polished bronze oval that caught no light but her own reflection. She studied herself, unpainted, unbraided, unadorned. In this state, she was neither sovereign nor spectacle, only woman, vessel, ritual. A single attendant approached and without a word, held out the dusk balm, a tiny pot containing powdered pine soot and ground frankincense mixed with starch of wild yam. With a thin brush, the Empress herself applied it along the hollows beneath her eyes and across her collarbone, a ritual meant to draw down the day's fire and usher in night's cool. A final puff of powdered hawthorn root and fermented barley was applied to her chest and belly. This combination, earthy and faintly sweet, had been passed down from concubines of dynasties long gone. Its function was more spiritual than hygienic. It calmed the liver, softened the pulse, and silenced anxious dreams. Once applied, a maid secured a thin wrap around her waist made of cotton mulmul, stitched with the character for quiet in pale gold thread. Now came the final fragrance. The Empress stood once more as a eunuch brought forward a shallow bowl of charcoal dust. From it, he lifted a strip of silk ribbon that had rested within for hours. The Empress took the ribbon and tied it into her loosened hair, the strands falling over it like reeds over a stream. The charcoal's faint scent mingled with the oils and powders already layered through her body, forming a complex perfume only she carried. One that marked the ending of day and the descent into private night. She stepped into her chamber. The bed had already been prepared, thin matting of pressed seaweed fibers, topped with a light quilt of reed cotton and lotus floss. She lay down, spine to the mat, hands resting atop her belly. An attendant adjusted the gauze canopy overhead, filtering what little remained of the dying light. The Empress's eyes closed, and from a distance a bell sounded once, long and low, like the breath of the earth. There would be no dreams tonight, not ones that clung or shouted. The Empress had left her day behind without water, without scrubbing, without even lifting a basin. And yet, every inch of her body was clean, ritually, ceremonially, holy. It was not the absence of dirt that mattered, but the presence of intention. Powder, dust, scent, fiber, these were her water. They had carried her through the day, and now they carried her into sleep. Outside her window, the palace grounds lay quiet beneath a veil of stars. The Empress slept, perfumed and powdered, a sovereign wrapped not in silk, but in stillness itself. The heat had already settled before the sun climbed the full arc of its rise. In the innermost courts of palaces stretched across the deserts of Arabia, the dense jungles of Southeast Asia, and the humid plains of sub-Saharan Africa, royal women stirred from their slumber not with eagerness, but with awareness of the air pressing against their skin like damp cloth, of the heavy scent of night sweat lingering beneath silk, and of the day's inevitable discomfort yet to come. To rule or even simply survive in such climates was not merely a matter of politics or bloodline, it was a discipline of the flesh. For queens, princesses, concubines, and consorts, the body was both battleground and altar, a vessel of sacred lineage and a trap of warm skin in a world that rarely cooled. Cleanliness was not merely virtue, it was presentation, diplomacy, and survival. But water, though revered, was often rationed or avoided. In the fierce heat, bathing could bring its own risks, fainting, fever, imbalance of inner energies. And so, centuries before the invention of soap or modern deodorants, royal women turned to a much older science, the art of concealment, of scent, of layered rituals designed to coax the body into silence. It began before dawn. The women of the palace, some wives, others mistresses, all under the eye of power, rose not to the call of birdsong, but to the whisper of waiting servants. In royal harems from Fez to Lahore, from the Forbidden City to the inland empires of Benin, female attendants moved silently, feet bare against polished stone floors still cool from the breath of night. A silver basin was placed beside each woman's bed, not for bathing, but for wiping. Into the water were steeped things chosen with care, citrus peel, camphor bark, lemongrass, or basil leaves bruised just enough to bleed scent. With fine cloths, never coarse, the attendants would dab and press along the key places of the body, the underarms behind the knees, the hollow of the collarbone, the underside of the breast. They did not scrub, they coaxed. To do otherwise would awaken the skin too harshly and risk perspiration before the day even began. Then came the powders. This was a ritual older than ink, passed down among women through whispered formulas and practiced hands. In ancient Egypt, ground alabaster was mixed with powdered myrrh and applied to armpits with fingertips dipped in rose oil. In India, a mixture of sandalwood and crushed vetiver roots was pressed into the skin, both to cool and to veil. In the islands of Indonesia, dried pandanus leaves were ground with clove and nutmeg, stored in clay pots beneath the bed. A pinch of powder rubbed into the pulse points could mask the truth of a sleepless, overheated night. But perhaps nowhere was the morning ritual more complex than in the palaces of Mughal India, where entire chambers were devoted to fragrance. In one such palace, the Begum would rise and sit cross-legged upon a low cushion, her long black hair braided loosely down her back, still damp from the midnight sweat that clung to her neck. Her body had not been bathed in water for 3 days, not out of neglect, but tradition. Instead, her maidservants approached her with trays laden not with towels, but with earth. Yes, earth, specifically attars, oils distilled from flowers and herbs through ancient alchemical processes into highly concentrated perfumes. They were kept in crystal vials sealed with wax, each labeled not with a name, but a time of day. The Begum selected morning wind, a blend of saffron, green mango skin, and crushed betel leaf, and instructed its application to the inner elbows, the nape, and behind the ears. No drop touched the surface of the skin directly. First, the oil was rubbed onto a thin slip of cotton or gold-threaded gauze. Only then was it pressed to the flesh. Direct contact was considered too overwhelming, a clash of energies. The scent, the royal women believed, must bloom slowly, drawn out by the body's heat, not stifled by it. And there was more. In the Ethiopian highlands, royal brides would sleep upon mattresses stuffed with dried lavender and holy basil. These were not chosen for comfort, but for their effect. The heat would release their scent upward toward the skin throughout the night, acting as both deodorizer and sedative. In Siam, female nobility slept with tiny clay pots tucked beneath their beds, filled with cooling rice paste mixed with mint and lime. Each morning, they would apply a trace of this paste beneath their arms and along the small of the back. It was not merely scent, it was protection, a means of keeping the sweat at bay through a layer of invisible armor. Perfume, though indispensable, was never the first line of defense. Its role was theatrical, not practical. The real work was done through absorption and prevention. In northern Africa, for instance, it was common for royal women to apply a thin layer of henna, not for decoration, but for scent. When mixed with jasmine oil and set overnight, the henna paste would stain not only the skin but also infuse the body with a lasting aroma. This scent, earthy and sweet, would remain for days, through heat, motion, and even passion. By mid-morning, the palace had transformed. Tiled floors radiated heat. Curtains no longer billowed, but hung limp. The scent of morning powder began to fade, and the body resumed its natural protest against the sun. Here, in these hours, another layer of strategy was applied. Wardrobe was as much a tool of hygiene as beauty. Loose silks, bleached cottons, or sheer linens were worn not only for grace but for airflow. Garments were designed to move, not to cling. In the courts of the Ottoman Empire, the Sultan's favored consorts were known to wear robes dyed with indigo, a cooling pigment believed to repel heat. Beneath their outer garments, however, they often wore narrow strips of cloth beneath the arms, early versions of what we might now call sweat pads. These were removed and replaced at intervals throughout the day, always discreetly, always in silence. In Persia, women of high status had undergarments woven with crushed alum into the fibers. Alum, a natural astringent and deodorizer, would prevent the development of odor and lessen sweat. The garments themselves were discarded at the end of each day, not washed, but buried and burned, a ritual both hygienic and symbolic. For a royal woman to discard such a garment was akin to shedding the impurity of the day, a return to divine cleanliness before sleep. Sometimes the greatest tools were invisible. In the court of the Vietnamese emperors, the empress would sit for hours in rooms cooled with jade tiles and misted with herbal steam. These steam rooms were not heated but cooled using underground spring water, funneled through hollow bamboo pipes. The air would collect the scent of lemongrass and star anise, slowly diffusing it through the room. The empress would sit cross-legged, her hands folded on her lap, her face glistening, not from sweat, but from dew. It was said that she smelled of the forest after rain, but all this served another, deeper purpose. Cleanliness was never simply for personal comfort. It was display, power, seduction, control. In Mali, the queen mothers were known to command entire scent rituals before audiences with nobles. They would arrive not immediately, but only after the room had been perfumed with incense burned from aged myrrh and the leaves of the baobab tree. The queen herself would enter through a curtain soaked in floral water, and her presence was marked not by sound but by fragrance. Her odor, or lack of it, was her first word. By midday, when the heat was at its worst, the palace retreated into silence. Windows were shuttered, courtyards emptied, servants moved slowly, breathing through cloths soaked in orange blossom water. And the women? They did not bathe, for that would incite sweat anew. Instead, they reclined in shaded rooms lined with marble, lying upon cushions filled with date palm husks and cooled sand. Their attendants would return, not with buckets or towels, but with fans, feathered, scented, and sometimes dipped in wine or rosewater. The fans were waved not only to move air, but to distribute the perfume that clung to their mistresses' garments, hair, and skin. Some fans even had compartments that held pellets of solid perfume, compressed from flowers and resins into small coins that slowly released their fragrance with each wave. Here, in this moment of enforced stillness, the body was preserved like a sacred artifact, still, scented, composed. Even in sweat, it did not surrender. To be a royal woman in a hot climate was to live in a world of illusion, one where heat was conquered not by force but by mastery of ritual, scent, fabric, and self. Her cleanliness was never truly about being clean. It was about appearing untouched by the heat that defeated lesser mortals. It was about creating the mirage of coolness in a world of fire. And that illusion, performed day after day, was among her most formidable powers. By late afternoon, the sun bore down not only from above but from the earth itself, reflected off sand, stone, and sea. Shadows offered no true relief. They were shallow, flickering things that moved with the hour, but held little mercy. Yet within the innermost chambers of palaces, hidden behind carved lattice screens, behind doors painted with lacquer and sealed with quiet, a second phase of preparation began. For the body's resistance to heat was never enough. The performance of freshness had to be renewed, and this time it had to hold until the fall of night. The women knew this intimately. They did not merely live in the heat, they were artists of surviving it. While peasants and slaves sweated openly in the fields and courtyards, the royal woman was expected to glow, not perspire. Her scent must remain consistent, her garments must not cling, her skin must remain dry to the touch, even after hours of sitting in a room with no moving air. But now, hours after their first preparation, the scent of rose oil had faded. The powders beneath the arms had been tested by time. Silk clung slightly beneath the breasts, and so the women turned to refreshment not through water, but through ritual rebirth. In the palaces of the Khmer Empire, this ritual was called the second skin. Attendants would bring small bowls of chilled starch, usually rice water steeped with vetiver root and pandan. This mixture was not eaten. It was wiped across the arms and neck with a fine muslin cloth, tightening the pores and restoring a sheen to the skin that mimicked coolness. After drying, a fresh layer of herbal dust was applied, this time infused with crushed lotus petals and dried tea leaves. The effect was not to cleanse, but to simulate, to tell the eye and the nose a different story than the body might confess. In Arabia, frankincense smoke was used instead. The woman would stand over a small burner, letting the curls of scented smoke pass beneath her loose garments. The smoke carried not only scent, but dryness. It absorbed what the heat had pulled from her body. Then she would step away from the smoke and be dressed again, this time in garments that had been cooled in clay jars overnight. Cooling the cloth was considered essential. Heat retained in fabric was seen as both a medical and spiritual danger. In the Sahelian kingdoms of West Africa, a royal woman might choose to renew herself through le parfum brûlé, burned perfume. Solid cones of scent shaped from gum arabic, charcoal dust, and crushed florals were lit and placed beneath the seat of a wooden stool. The woman would sit above the smoke, legs parted, gown gathered up around her waist. The steam and smoke rose between her thighs, cleansing not only the body, but the spirit. These ceremonies were private, sacred, and rarely spoken of, passed down only among royal wives, concubines, and daughters. Even in East Asia, where modesty was ritualized and privacy was a political necessity, similar strategies prevailed. In imperial Japan, noble women, especially those of the high-end court, were expected to remain indoors, hidden from direct sun, their bodies shielded by layers of robe and curtain. But the heat crept in regardless, and so they turned to incense, not as perfume, but as identity. Every woman had her own a personal blend of incense, wood, and herb, formulated by hand or passed down by family line. Her clothing, her hair, even the letters she wrote were scented with this unique aroma. In a time before mirrors were common, this scent was how others recognized her presence. And so, even as sweat threatened to betray the body, the air around her was dominated by this signature scent, a smoke veil of identity that overpowered any sign of the flesh. In China's southern provinces, the practice of ice threading was reserved only for the highest-ranking women in the hottest months. A servant would take a long needle of silver or gold, cooled in a block of ice, and gently roll it along the woman's inner arms, collarbone, and thighs. Not enough to break the skin, never that, but just enough to awaken the nerves. Afterwards, a liquid was brushed onto the path of the cold, green tea steeped in chrysanthemum, stirred with jade. This liquid left behind no scent, but a sensation of coolness that lingered for hours. But not all royal women had the privilege of such isolation. In the palaces of the Abbasid Caliphate, women of the harem were expected to be ever present, ever beautiful, and ever prepared. Their visibility was paradoxical. Hidden from the world, yet constantly watched. Heat was their enemy, but scent was their weapon. Before every appearance in the marble halls, before every invitation to the evening majlis, the women of rank would don a special cloak, light as air, woven of linen thread soaked in saffron and cardamom. These cloaks were never worn outside. They were for performance only, for walking into a room and leaving the memory of spice behind. It is no coincidence that many of the world's greatest perfumes were invented in the service of women like these. In Renaissance Venice, where royal women endured summer air heavy with swamp stink and sewage, scent became survival. But the perfume was never placed directly on the skin. Instead, women wore small perforated lockets called pomanders, hollow orbs filled with waxes infused with lavender, clove, and musk. These were worn around the waist or pinned inside bodices. Some were even built into rings or hair combs. Each time the woman moved, the scent released, distracting, deflecting, defending. In the Ethiopian Empire, it was common to braid small blossoms of acacia or orange flower directly into the hair, not only for beauty, but as a functional aroma. Sweat from the scalp would rehydrate the blossoms, refreshing their scent. Hair itself became a medium of perfume, but it wasn't just sweat that had to be hidden. Royal women also faced the problem of proximity. Lovers, husbands, and rivals often came too close. In these intimate spaces, the body had to perform another lie, the illusion of perpetual freshness, even in motion, even in the act of desire. And so, the body was prepared not just for appearance, but for intimacy. In India, the royal courtesans and queens alike were taught preparation for touch. Before expected encounters, the body was warmed, not cooled, to release scent. Ghee was rubbed into the skin, followed by a dusting of clove and mace. Then, a final layer of rose petal paste was applied and allowed to sit. Only then was the woman bathed, very briefly, with warm water. The scent, now absorbed deep into the pores, would emerge slowly with body heat, creating the impression of natural sweetness. In Cambodia, queens used scented balms made of tamarind pulp and honey. These were massaged into the thighs, behind the knees, and between the breasts. Not only did they soften the skin, they fermented slightly on the flesh, creating a smell that was not floral, but warm, edible, and faintly intoxicating. Men believed it was the woman's own aroma. They were never told otherwise. Southeast Asian women also used betel leaf to mask bodily scent. Before sex, a woman might chew betel, swish the infused saliva in her mouth, and then exhale onto her lover's chest. The scent lingered, spicy, sharp, slightly numbing. It redirected the senses, and even in the courts of medieval Europe, the noble women had their own strategies. Before an encounter, a lady might rub her thighs with cut lemon or vinegar-soaked herbs. Her hands might be coated in scented wax. Even the sheets were prepared, sprinkled with lavender water or rose water left to steep in snow. Her scent would not only be on her skin, but on everything he touched. The illusion, once again, had to be complete. But by early evening, when the light turned golden and the day finally began to relent, these preparations shifted once more. A new kind of presentation began, less private, more ceremonial. Now the royal women appeared before others. Now they dined, conversed, walked among gardens, sat on balconies where others might glimpse them. And now, more than ever, their scent had to tell a story. Evening scent was different. It was heavier, more deliberate. In Egypt, the women of the pharaoh's court would dab spikenard oil behind the ears and on the inner wrists. This oil, dark, syrupy, sacred, was too overpowering for the day. But at dusk, it blended with the cooling air, creating a kind of perfume mist around the woman. In the palaces of Morocco, the women used ambergris, a waxy, rare substance found floating in the sea and believed to be a gift from the gods. Ambergris, when warmed on the skin, released a scent unlike anything else. Marine, musky, ancient. It was rubbed in tiny amounts at the base of the spine, the sternum, and under the breasts. Only those closest to the woman could detect it. It was the scent of secrets. Some royal women took pride in blending their own perfumes. In the harem of Sultan Suleiman, the concubines were trained in scent-making as both art and power. They ground dried roses with musk and cinnamon, soaked it in oil for a week, and then filtered it through silk. Each woman's scent became her trademark, an olfactory signature by which the sultan might remember her. It was said that Hurrem, the sultan's favorite, used black currant and clove in hers, sweet and biting at once. By nightfall, the world slowed. The palace grew quiet again, but the body did not rest. It perspired still, especially in closed rooms where torches burned and silks trapped heat. And so a final ritual was performed. A thin veil of cloth soaked in chilled water and scented with mint was passed across the woman's body, not to cleanse, but to cool. Her garments were changed once more. Her hair was unbound and brushed with perfumed combs. A final drop of scent, just one, was applied to the heart. Then she would sleep, or at least pretend to, because even sleep for a royal woman was performance. Her pillow was stuffed with dried herbs. Her bedding was perfumed. The room itself was smoked with herbs that lingered on her skin until morning. Should anyone enter in the night, a lover, a rival, an assassin, she would not smell of sweat. She would smell like legend. In the innermost wing of the Mughal palace at Agra, shaded by hanging jute drapes and cooled by a trickle of perfumed water running through marble troughs, the royal women performed their silent rites of concealment. Though the air outside was thick with the damp breath of monsoon heat, inside, the walls echoed with the whisper of sandalwood fans and the rustle of silk against bare skin. These women, bound not by chains but by decorum and dynasty, had learned from birth that the body must be disguised, its scent, its heat, its impulses. Cleanliness was not simply comfort, it was politics, and nowhere was this clearer than in how they masked their scent. The ritual began long before midday. In the early hours, the concubines and noblewomen were woken by the sound of a distant flute and the faint jingle of anklets in the corridor. A group of servants entered bearing clay pots, their contents still warm from the subterranean kitchens, infusions of rose water, jasmine, and the sharp resin of oud bark. The women would first inhale deeply over the pots, letting the steam open their pores. A soft cloth soaked in these oils was passed from hand to hand, patted gently beneath their arms, between their thighs, and along the backs of their knees. They did not bathe fully, not every day. Water was precious and heavy, and full submersion was considered weakening to the body's natural heat. Instead, scent was layered with patience. Next came the powder, ground sandalwood mixed with crushed vetiver roots and the ash of dried neem leaves. The mixture was stored in carved sandalwood boxes, the lids fragrant in themselves. Applied to pulse points, the powder absorbed perspiration and released a slow, dry perfume as the skin warmed. It was a scent both medicinal and sensual, neither fully floral nor purely woody, something that made one lean closer without understanding why. Their garments played a role too. The innermost robes, thin muslin stitched by hand, were soaked the night before in diluted oils, clove, rose, saffron, and cardamom. When the cloth dried, it retained a memory of the oil, a ghost of scent that clung to the skin. With every motion, with every shift in posture or flick of the wrist, a different layer of aroma was released. It was said in whispers that the emperor's favorite could be detected before she turned the corridor, not by sight, not by voice, but by the honeyed smell of kesar and milk warmed on her skin. Some women, especially elder matriarchs, relied on even older practices. In their private chambers, they would heat tiny brass cups over coals and fill them with agarwood chips. The smoke, blue, gray, and heavy, was allowed to curl around their undergarments before dressing. The fabric drank the smoke, and in doing so, masked any trace of human odor with the deep musk of burning wood and earth, a walking incense. In the Persian courts, similar traditions endured. The Queen Mother in Isfahan, now past her years of political usefulness, but revered for her knowledge, instructed her granddaughters in ancient recipes. One involved mixing lemon peel with ground camphor, binding it in silk, and placing it beneath the breast folds. Another called for rose petals steeped in vinegar and dabbed onto the nape of the neck with eagle feathers, a cooling method meant to calm the body's internal fires. Elsewhere, in the sweltering Andalusian courts of Al-Andalus, women concocted their own fragrant armor. The Moors had brought with them a passion for botanical study, and gardens overflowed with lavender, rosemary, and orange blossom. These plants were dried, crushed, and sewn into tiny pouches hidden inside the folds of robes and beneath hair wraps. The royal women moved through palace halls like a breeze from the orchard, fragrant and intangible. But there was another layer, something deeper, more secretive. It was not just the perfumes and powders that masked the scent of sweat. It was the control of the body itself. The women were taught to move slowly, deliberately. Quick movements were discouraged. They were told, do not run, do not climb, do not dance wildly unless you are in the bathhouse. The body should remain cool from the inside out. They drank infusions to cool their blood, drinks made from cucumber seed, basil, tamarind, and melon rind. A favorite among royal women of Baghdad was a chilled syrup made from dried limes and rose hips, said to lower the body's inner heat and slow the pulse. This philosophy even extended to food. Spicy dishes were believed to stoke inner fires, to excite the blood and produce more sweat. So, meals for royal women during the hottest months were carefully planned. Yogurt soups, almond milk with ice from the mountains, rice cooled with mint and fennel. Every sense was governed. Even their beds were arranged with scent in mind. Before sleep, young girls were tasked with sprinkling rosewater onto sheets. The pillows were filled not only with feathers, but with dried herbs, lavender for rest, myrrh for depth. The idea was that scent should never leave the body, not even in dreams. In Nubian palaces, where desert winds blew relentlessly across open courtyards, queens used a paste made from henna, cinnamon, and wild myrrh. The mixture was applied to the soles of the feet, the backs of the knees, and behind the ears. It dried into a thin crust that cracked slightly as they moved, releasing aroma throughout the day. Even their sweat was curated, transformed into an act of art. But all these methods served more than vanity. Scent was status. In societies where most toiled in fields under a scorching sun, smelling of toil, of cattle, of garlic and earth, the absence of odor among royals was a form of power. It was as if their bodies transcended the grime of labor, as if their blood ran cleaner, as if they were not made of the same flesh. For this reason, even servants tasked with preparing their powders were not permitted to touch the queen directly. There was always a layer, a glove, a cloth, a spoon. The body of a royal woman was a shrine, and odor was its blasphemy. In Thailand's Ayutthaya kingdom, court ladies used pomanders, small balls made from wax and musk, wrapped in silk and carried in sleeves. They would press the balls against their skin in discreet gestures beneath the arms, along the collarbone, even between the toes. These acts were done with a grace so subtle it seemed part of the choreography of palace life. A dab of wax as one turned a page, a press of musk as one adjusted a bracelet. Over time, these gestures became muscle memory. Little movements, tiny presses, wipes, flicks, embedded in the daily routine like sutras, passed from mother to daughter, from governess to ward, until every girl knew not only how to hide her odor, but how to do so without a single soul ever noticing. And yet, for all their layers of perfume and powdered secrecy, the fear of scent never fully left them. At night, when candles had been snuffed and sandalwood coils burned low, when the air grew still and only the soft breath of rest remained, some of them would press their noses to their own skin in the dark, and they would search for the one trace of themselves that had escaped the mask. A whisper of armpit, a trace of breath on silk, a ghost of sweat. And if they found nothing, they would sleep like queens. If they found something, they would not sleep at all. In the most sacred inner courts of the Ottoman Topkapi Palace, the harem was not merely a place of seclusion, it was a theater of scent. There, beneath domed ceilings painted with golden vines, lived women who had mastered the art of making themselves unforgettable without saying a word. Their power lay not in speech, nor even in sight, but in the lingering trail they left behind, a presence woven in scent. Here, the practice of masking the body's odor was elevated to ritualistic extremes. Every morning, after the silence of dawn prayers, the favored women of the Sultan began their preparations, not for war or for rule, but for control of their own bodily perception. The most prized among them were not always the most beautiful, but the most elusive. Their bodies never betrayed the staleness of heat or confinement. They moved like wind through jasmine fields, leaving behind a trace so light and precise that even the eunuchs paused. Perfume, for these women, was a shield, but it was never applied in haste. It began with the bath, not of water, but of smoke. A censer was brought to each chamber, burning oud, ambergris, and dried orange peel. The women would disrobe and stand naked over the smoke, allowing it to pass beneath them, between their legs, under their arms, into their hair. The smoke closed every pore, drying moisture before it began, and replacing natural scent with layers of earth and citrus. Then came the attar, oils so concentrated they could ignite under flame. Just one drop on the wrist, rubbed between the breasts or behind the ears, could last for days. These oils were kept locked in carved ivory boxes guarded by older women known only as keepers of scent, passed down through generations. Their hands never trembled, their noses sharper than a hound's. They were said to know if a woman had sweated in her sleep just by passing her chamber door. One of the most coveted perfumes was made from civet, a musky substance extracted from a wild cat, diluted and blended with saffron and rose. It was dangerous to overuse. A single drop too much, and the fragrance became animalistic. But used properly, it mimicked the scent of skin warmed in passion, without ever sweating. In the Moroccan palaces of Fez, where desert winds made stone walls sweat, queens practiced the art of fragrant fasting. For 3 days before appearing at court, they would consume no onions, no garlic, no red meats. Instead, they lived on mint water, dates soaked in milk, and tiny cakes of almond flour and orange blossom. Their bodies were flushed of strong scents from the inside out. Their sweat, should it come, was neutral, even sweet, and for the rare occasions when bathing with water became unavoidable, it was not done with haste. A full body rinse was considered sacred. Flowers, freshly picked jasmine, marigold, and crushed hibiscus were floated in the water. Saffron threads were added to tint the skin. Sometimes a string of pearls was dropped in, believed to soften the body's scent and bring wealth to the womb. But no story of bodily concealment would be complete without the Chinese royal courts, where empresses developed fragrance rituals so intricate they became indistinguishable from religion. In the Forbidden City, palace women wore tiny ceramic discs beneath their garments, hand-painted with cherry blossoms and laced with powdered iris. These discs were gently warmed by body heat and emitted a steady floral scent all day. Servants would replace them before sunset, always with freshly perfumed ones. No woman in the royal household was allowed to have a natural smell, even in sleep. Even more curious were the fragrant inks used in correspondence. Letters between royal women were often written with rose-tinted ink, made by boiling petals with clove and cinnamon. The parchment, once dried, retained a perfume. A woman could receive a letter from a cousin in another province and know instantly, by scent alone, that it had passed through the hands of royalty. Across the Indian subcontinent, in Rajputana's high forts, queens kept birds trained in fragrance. Doves and mynas were brushed with perfume-infused dust and released into bedchambers. The fluttering of wings spread scent into drapes, sheets, even the skin of those asleep. When the birds left, the chamber remained fragrant for hours. These rituals, though extravagant, served one relentless purpose: to erase the evidence of the body. Because the royal body, especially the female one, was meant to seem otherworldly, free from stink, from rot, from the earthly weight of flesh. A woman who smelled too human was thought to be too close to sin, and sin had no place in the lineage of kings. Yet beneath these layers of musk and flowers, powder and prayer, lived women who still sweated, women who felt the fire of summer on their backs, who lay in silken robes secretly soaked through, who feared being summoned at an unexpected hour, not because of the Sultan's gaze, but because they might not have time to mask the truth of their bodies. Some carried emergency sachets of crushed mint hidden in their rings. Others chewed herbs throughout the day, believing that sweet breath would translate to sweet skin. In the Ethiopian court of Gondar, queens carried hollow bangles filled with dried frankincense dust, which they could sprinkle discreetly when lifting a veil. But still, sweat came. And in the quietest corners of palaces, in the dim rooms between duty and dusk, these women sat with mirrors and sniffed their own wrists. Not out of vanity, but vigilance, because a single scent could unravel everything. A mist patch beneath the arm, the faintest saltiness behind the ear, a lingering trace of fear, and so they checked and masked and powdered again, and then, only then, did they return to court, gliding like spirits, with faces carved from serenity and bodies that seemed untouched by heat, by hunger, by anything as ordinary as being human. In the end, the art of scent concealment was not merely cosmetic, it was survival. To be odorless was to be ethereal was to be above suspicion, and to be above suspicion was to be safe. Even centuries later, in ruins and tombs, archaeologists sometimes find traces of these rituals. Dried roses clinging to fabric, microscopic remains of sandalwood powder on combs, vessels that once held oils now evaporated into silence. But the women who used them are gone, their names erased, their stories scattered, their sweat forgotten. Only the idea of them remains, soft, silent, perfumed, and if you close your eyes, you might imagine them still walking the palace halls, still scentless, still watching. The palace was silent in the early hours of the morning. Only the soft rustling of silk slippers and the flickering hush of oil lamps disturbed the heavy air. Somewhere deep inside the private quarters, behind embroidered screens and carved sandalwood doors, a royal woman stirred in her bed. Her attendants were already awake. They moved like shadows, quiet and obedient, setting out bowls of rose water and warming linen cloths over gentle fires. Their mistress would not rise for another hour. But her toilet, the ritual of cleaning her body, her face, her most intimate places, was a ceremony in itself. This was not merely hygiene, it was status, ritual, secrecy. Because in the world of queens and empresses, of noble women and concubines, every part of the body, even the ones no one was meant to see, had to be treated with reverence, care, and layers of scented concealment. Especially in places where water was rare, privacy was sacred, and the human body was always at odds with the expectations of nobility. So what did royal women use when nature called and toilet paper did not exist? The answer is both strange and revealing. It tells us about comfort and pain, indulgence and austerity. It tells us how kingdoms treated their women, by what they were allowed to touch, and what they were forced to endure. In ancient Mesopotamia, around 3000 BC, the concept of toilet paper was unthinkable. Even the ruling elite of Sumer and Akkad, robed in finery and drenched in perfumes, wiped themselves with whatever was close at hand. A handful of reeds, perhaps, a smoothed piece of pottery, maybe even a scrap of wool cloth, precious, reused and hidden away from view. Clay tablets speak of servants tasked with collecting and laundering linen used by royal women for secrets not to be spoken. The Chinese, ever more advanced in sanitation, did invent paper. By the 6th century AD, the elite were using perfumed sheets of coarse bamboo paper for the toilet, reserved exclusively for the imperial court. But before that, the women of the Han and Tang dynasties had to rely on silk scraps, dried leaves, and bundles of soft grasses, woven and soaked in warm water to reduce their harshness. For an empress, anything less than softness was an insult to her dignity, and yet the reality was often grittier, more painful. There are records of royal concubines in the Forbidden City wrapping their fingers in silk ribbons dipped in lotus water before cleaning themselves. These were not reused. They were discarded into specially lined basins, then burned so no trace remained. Not even the wind carried the shame of bodily waste. In ancient Egypt, where the heat pressed down like a living weight, the elite women of the court had their own methods. Papyrus was abundant, and it was used, not only for writing decrees and prayers, but also for the body. Flattened, softened, and moistened with oils, papyrus strips were sometimes employed by high-status women in place of cloth, and where papyrus could not reach, a servant's hand often did, carefully, respectfully, with soft linen wrapped around the fingers and infused with frankincense, myrrh, or juniper. Even Cleopatra herself, mistress of beauty and power, is said to have demanded a unique blend of rose oil-soaked wool for her private chamber. She believed the scent not only cleansed the flesh, but banished evil spirits that might hide in the damp folds of the body. The cloths were never seen in public, and their disposal was entrusted to a single slave sworn to silence. In Rome, the communal latrines of the empire contrasted sharply with the guarded privacy of noble women's quarters. While the commoners wiped with a shared sponge on a stick, cleaned in vinegar water and passed from hand to hand, wealthy women had their own attendants who carried bundles of fine fabric in small ivory boxes. These cloths were used, folded neatly, then removed by another servant and taken to special washrooms hidden far from the public eye. A Roman Matrona might never touch her own waist. She was above such things. Her hands were for embroidery, for pouring wine into goblets, for adjusting the golden clasps at her breast. Her body was sacred, even in its dirt. In medieval Europe, when castles were cold and drafty and toilets were little more than chutes carved into stone, royal women had few pleasant options. The garderobes, their name derived from guarding robes from lice, were grim, vertical shafts leading to open air. There, a queen might crouch over a wooden seat while her ladies waited outside with scraps of wool, moss wrapped in linen, or, if the kingdom was wealthy, imported scraps of fine cotton from the east, cut into squares and perfumed with lavender. Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, no stranger to travel or politics, was known to carry her own chest of personal linens. Among the silks and jewels were tightly folded pieces of cloth embroidered with her crest, used for cleaning, washed in herbs, and kept separate from the linens of lesser ladies. But even in the most elevated households, nothing was as personal or as revealing as what a woman used in the bathroom. The Japanese court, too, held its own secrets. In the Heian period, noble women wore 12 layers of silk and carried hidden fans to communicate their feelings. But when nature called, they had to strip down in carefully orchestrated steps. Wiping was done with long sticks wrapped in soft mulberry paper or delicate bamboo brushes dipped in warm water. These were brought by handmaids and removed before any man could see, and when such implements were used by the Empress herself, they were never reused by anyone else, not even touched. They were burned in secret gardens, alongside offerings of flowers and incense. Privacy was not just a comfort, it was a matter of spiritual purity. In some corners of the Islamic world, where running water was revered and hygiene linked to religious duty, royal women had access to something closer to modern sanitation. Ceramic jugs filled with rose water were poured by servants as noble women squatted over marble basins in private hammams. The wiping was done not with cloth, but with smooth pebbles or fingers, followed by cleansing with water, scented and warmed. The finest harems employed eunuchs trained in the art of discreet cleanliness. No word was spoken, no gaze lingered. Cleanliness, in every culture, had less to do with the body and more to do with control. For royal women, who were watched, judged, and often confined, the ability to hide the messy details of their biology was a kind of power. It let them preserve the illusion that queens and empresses did not sweat, did not smell, and certainly did not defecate. And yet, behind these heavy curtains, in the chill of early morning or the stillness of late night, their bodies told a different truth, a truth concealed in cloth and ash, in water and fire, in silence and ritual. Because when a royal woman wiped herself clean, she wasn't just removing waste. She was maintaining a mask, one stitched by generations of expectation, shame, and impossible grace. And it is in those cloths, those perfumed rags and burned silks, that the hidden story of queens truly begins. In the corridors of Versailles, where mirrors reflected the shimmer of candlelight and gossip passed faster than the wind, royal women walked in silence, their gowns sweeping polished marble. They were queens, duchesses, and mistresses of kings. Their voices were soft, their hands gloved, their skin powdered, but their bodies were still bodies, living, sweating, and excreting, and when nature called, they did not answer it like common folk. The toilette of a French royal woman was an event. It was not only the morning ceremony of powders and perfumes, but the intimate moment when her body was cleaned after its most human acts. The chambre de retrait, a private retiring room, was more than a toilet. It was a sanctuary of modesty, an altar of illusion. Toilet paper as we know it did not exist in 17th or 18th century France. Instead, a queen might wipe herself with soft linen cloths infused with rose water, warmed over coals and folded by hand. These cloths were reused after careful washing in secret laundries, attended only by trusted maids. Some were embroidered with royal crests, not to show off, but to ensure no one else dared touch them. The cloths were kept in carved wooden boxes, lacquered and sealed with wax, guarded not for their value, but for the scandal they could cause if seen. For if anyone knew exactly how a queen kept herself clean, the spell of her divinity might be broken. Marie Antoinette, forever burdened by rumor, had an elaborate routine. Her morning began not with perfume, but with a scented cloth soaked in orange blossom water, passed to her by her femme de chambre. She dabbed her neck, her wrists, and yes, her most private parts, with the same cloth. No roughness, no haste. The cloth was taken away immediately, folded into an envelope of silk, never to be seen again. What happened to it afterward is lost to time. Some said it was burned, others claimed it was buried beneath rose bushes in the Queen's Grove. In the Ottoman Empire, within the deep walls of Topkapi Palace, the harem was not merely a prison of silk and shadows. It was a highly organized institution with its own rules, routines, and rituals. The women of the Sultan's harem, concubines, favorites, and royal wives, had access to one of the world's most refined systems of bathing and cleansing. Each royal woman was assigned a kira, a female servant responsible for maintaining her hygiene in total secrecy. These women were trained in the art of abdest, the Islamic practice of ritual washing. After relieving themselves, the women would cleanse with perfumed water, often using their left hand wrapped in fine muslin soaked in mint and rose oil. Instead of wiping alone, they practiced istinja, the washing of private parts with water poured from ornate ewers of brass or silver. The process was gentle, slow, and deeply spiritual, and yet, even then, they might pat themselves dry with embroidered squares of linen or raw silk, never reused, discarded into fire pits hidden below the palace. In the Mughal Empire, the royal zananas, the women's quarters, followed similar customs. Here, water was king, clean, flowing, and scented. A Mughal empress had personal attendants who carried ceramic ewers and soft cotton cloths in baskets woven of gold-threaded reeds. They waited behind embroidered curtains as the empress squatted over a marble toilet recessed into the palace floor. Once finished, she was handed a folded square soaked in sandalwood water and dried in the sun to make it soft. These cloths were so prized that some were guarded with seals, and no male was ever allowed to know their purpose. The softest were made from the inner layers of the cotton flour, known as mulmul. So thin they were called woven air. The cloth touched the empress only once. It was burned with herbs and flower petals so the smoke would carry away the impurity. Such rituals were not only about comfort, they were about dignity. A royal woman's worth was tethered to the illusion of perfection. Her body could never betray her with odors or stains, and so she used whatever her kingdom could provide. Lavish cloth, rare water, the loyalty of silent hands. In the courts of Africa, among the kingdoms of Mali and Ethiopia, queens and princesses found their own ways to stay clean. In the heat of the Sahel, water was precious and privacy even more so. Women used tufts of cotton, sometimes boiled and dried in aromatic oils, to clean themselves discreetly. In some cases, plantain leaves were crushed and folded, used like wipes and then buried far from the household. Where royal compounds allowed, the queen's toilet was built above a pit lined with ash and clay, and the wiping cloths were thrown into smolder. In Ashanti tradition, a royal woman would never speak of such things aloud. Her attendants, however, knew exactly what to do. The cloths used were part of a hidden world of royal laundry, washed separately, dried on special lines behind tall walls where no man's eyes could see. Women trained for years before being entrusted with the disposal of such cloths. If they spoke of it, even once, they were dismissed or worse. Royal hygiene across cultures was a code of silence. In medieval Russia, noble women often visited the banya, the bathhouse. But when outside the bath, daily cleanliness was harder. There were no flush toilets. Instead, wooden seats were cut over pits and lined with fur in winter. The royal women used scraps of soft wool or animal pelts to wipe themselves, sometimes rubbed with dried herbs or oils to cover odor and discomfort. Tsarinas had dedicated chambermaids to wash these cloths in boiling water laced with birch ash. The waistcloths were never reused without purification, and they were kept in wooden trunks with lids sealed shut by wax or beeswax glue to contain the scent and the shame. The goal was always the same, to erase the body's marks. Not just because they were unpleasant, but because they made the queen too real, too human. In the Americas, the Mayan and Aztec nobility had their own systems. The noble women of Tenochtitlan, for instance, used soft bark scraped and dried from fig trees, which was then beaten and soaked in warm water. The result was a kind of primitive tissue, flexible and soft. This was not shared among the masses. It was for the elite only. The Inca queens of the Andes used llama wool, combed until it felt like cotton. These cloths were kept in bags of woven silver thread and thrown into sacred fires after use. For the Incas, cleanliness was not only about health, it was a gift to the gods. A clean body was a pure offering, and what touched a queen's flesh could never be touched again. And so it was that, across continents, through dynasties and empires, women of power cleaned themselves not only with cloth and water, but with secrecy, ritual, and the careful maintenance of a lie, that they were above the body. But in truth, they were not. They bled, they sweated, they needed to be wiped clean just like any other human being. The difference lay not in their needs, but in how those needs were hidden. With every perfumed cloth, every burned scrap of silk, royal women bought another moment of illusion, another day in which the court could pretend they were divine, untouchable, immaculate. But the truth was always there. In the folded rags, in the bowls of scented water, in the locked chests and whispered routines. The truth was that queens, for all their crowns, were still flesh and blood, still bound to the same earthly rituals as the lowest servant, and nowhere was that truth more visible, yet more invisible, than in what they used instead of toilet paper. Behind every royal woman there were silent hands, maids, nurses, governesses, who bore witness to the most unspoken rituals of the body. These women were not mere attendants. They were keepers of secrets, guardians of routines that no noble mouth dared utter aloud. In the Tudor court of England, a queen's privy was not a solitary place. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, was never truly alone. Her gentle women of the privy chamber were always within reach, trained in the art of invisibility. They turned their gaze to the wall when she relieved herself. They stepped forward wordlessly with folded cloths the moment she stood. They were her shadow. These cloths were made from the softest Flemish linen, washed until nearly translucent. They were soaked in rose water or vinegar and dried in sunlight to remove even a trace of odor. Some were sewn with tiny red thread knots, not as decoration, but to identify which cloths had already been used. Disposal was immediate, burned in hearths that doubled as foot warmers. Secrecy was absolute. A slip of the tongue meant banishment from court. Yet even a queen could not always mask the realities of her body. During her later years, Elizabeth suffered from digestive ailments that made her scent difficult to contain. Her women, in hushed tones, began carrying sachets of dried lavender in their sleeves. When she passed, they'd raise the sachets discreetly, not as an insult but as protection. Meanwhile, in the palaces of the Ming dynasty, Chinese empresses and concubines were surrounded by a world of obsessive cleanliness. Porcelain toilet pots, exquisitely painted with dragons and lotus flowers, were kept beneath carved wooden chairs, concealed by silk curtains. After use, the empress would be handed long, narrow strips of rice paper stored in scroll boxes. These papers were infused with natural oils, tea tree, camellia, or ylang ylang. Unlike commoners, the imperial household did not reuse anything. Each strip was burned in censers alongside incense. The ashes were collected and thrown into the river, considered a sacred cleansing gesture. Servants responsible for this task were eunuchs, trusted for their silence and their inability to father children. They were taught from childhood how to fold the paper properly, how to warm it slightly by holding it near a candle, how to bow and present it without ever raising their eyes. But not all royal women had access to such refinement. In 15th century Europe, even the most powerful duchesses sometimes traveled with little more than saddlebags and chamber pots. On the road, there were no marble privies or linen-wrapped comfort. Instead, they used what they could: scraps of cloth, tufts of moss, or even handfuls of hay softened by hand. These makeshift tools were thrown away immediately, buried or left behind under rocks. Their ladies-in-waiting carried bundles of emergency cloth, pre-perfumed and stitched shut with colored thread to ensure no one else dared use them. These bundles had names. In French court slang, they were called douceurs, little sweetnesses. In Italian courts, they were veli segreti, secret veils. Even in discomfort, language wrapped the act in poetry. In the palaces of the Safavid Empire, Persian princesses followed traditions older than their lineage. Their private rooms were built with small, beautifully tiled hammams, not just for bathing, but for elimination and purification. Water was again the instrument of cleanliness. After relieving themselves, they used strips of embroidered muslin, woven so thin it seemed to melt on the skin, moistened with jasmine water, or in winter, warm rose oil. The cloths were used only once and placed in covered brass containers sealed with beeswax. The cloths themselves were not discarded casually. They were buried under lime powder in special courtyards guarded by female attendants. This lime absorbed odor and destroyed bacteria, long before the science was understood. And the burial was symbolic. Impurity, once buried, could never rise again. Over in Japan, during the Edo period, imperial women used folded paper known as chugigami. These papers were handmade, soft, and sometimes scented with plum blossom oil. A princess might keep a lacquered box of them at her bedside, carved with cranes or chrysanthemums. These were not shared with anyone, not even other royals. Paper was personal, but some Japanese noble women preferred a method passed down from ancient times, kawakami, or water cleansing. A servant would pour water from a bamboo ladle while the woman squatted over a smooth stone basin. The water was warm, often steeped in herbs. The woman then used her hands to cleanse herself and dried gently with a folded silk cloth. This cloth, like others in the East, was incinerated in incense fires. The cloths were perfumed not to overpower odor, but to elevate the ritual to something sacred. In the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, noble women in cold climates found that cloth alone was not enough. In the dead of winter, wiping with wet rags could cause discomfort, even frostbite. So they turned to fur. Small pieces of rabbit or marten fur were used, soft, absorbent, and warm. These furs were kept in lidded silver boxes and cleaned with alcohol-based tinctures, then re-perfumed and dried. They were more costly than linen and harder to hide, but far more comforting. Only the most trusted women knew where these furs were kept, and when they were retired, tattered, soiled, or torn, they were burned in a fireplace sealed off by a brass grate. The fire was fed not just with wood, but with herbs, sage, chamomile, and mint. This made the smoke smell pleasant, masking the purpose of the flames. Not even the kitchen staff knew what the fires were for. In the kingdom of Siam, royal women practiced an ancient form of cleanliness, using lotus petals. These petals, large and velvety, were soaked in rainwater and kept cool in ceramic bowls. A princess might reach for one after squatting over a marble basin, and her attendant would hand her a small cluster, no more than 3 or 4 petals, soft, fragrant, ephemeral. Once used, the petals were gathered in a gold leaf bowl and later floated downriver during ritual festivals, symbolizing the passing of impurity. Each culture found its own answer to the same quiet question: how does a woman of power clean herself without revealing that she needs to? And again, the answer was the same: ritual, secrecy, and softness. Even in the Vatican, where queens were rare but noble women visited often, the papal court devised its own systems. Cardinals' mistresses, duchesses under spiritual guidance. They were granted use of private chapels with hidden privies. The cloths they used were white cotton, boiled with lavender, and signed with a cross in ink. Not to bless them, but to ensure they were tracked and burned. Cleanliness was next to godliness, but only if no one saw how it was done. In every palace, from Moscow to Kyoto, a royal woman's humanity was the one thing the world was never meant to see. And so she hid it behind layers of ceremony. She wrapped it in silk. She burned it with incense. She gave her most private moments to silence and to the flames. And every time she wiped herself, it was not just an act of hygiene. It was an act of erasure. In the grandeur of the Mughal courts, where fountains whispered and the scent of cardamom lingered in the air, royal women moved behind silk screens. Their footsteps were hushed by Persian carpets, and their presence was known only by the flicker of oil lamps as they passed. Yet beneath all that majesty, even a Mughal empress required the same quiet relief as the lowliest servant. Their cleansing rituals were carried out with great care, never spoken of aloud. In private quarters, copper vessels known as aftabas were filled with warm water steeped in rose and myrrh. After relieving themselves over marble floor basins inlaid with onyx or agate, the empresses were handed long ribbons of muslin soaked in the aromatic water. These were used only once and folded over discreetly, never to be seen again. Each cloth was burned in copper urns laced with sandalwood and frankincense. The smoke that curled from those urns smelled holy, not human. Royal women across empires and centuries lived in bodies as fragile, as earthy, and as inescapably real as any peasants, but their status demanded a transformation of the physical into the symbolic, the vulgar into the sacred. In the Byzantine Empire, imperial women had access to one of the most sophisticated hygiene systems in the medieval world. The empress's private latrines were outfitted with flowing water, piped in from aqueducts and filtered through ceramic grates. Her attendants handed her squares of woven cotton, embroidered with gold thread, not for decoration, but to signify that these cloths were never to be mistaken for common use. Some of these cloths were laced with oils that doubled as antiseptics, thyme, bay leaf, or even cedar. Others were pre-warmed by being folded into the sleeves of her chambermaids so they would not chill her skin. And when the Empress traveled, a set of portable privy chests were packed in her caravan, each containing scented cloths, wax-sealed pots for disposal, and even small censers to disguise unpleasant odors. These kits were called Hygia Sacrata, or Sacred Hygiene. In stark contrast stood the court of the French Sun King Louis XIV. At Versailles, splendor clashed with stench. Though famed for its luxury, the palace lacked sufficient sanitation. Royal women, queens, princesses, mistresses alike, resorted to makeshift relief in commodes disguised as footstools, hidden under curtains or behind tapestries. To wipe themselves, they used a combination of lace-edged linen squares and soft torn strips of flannel. Perfumed water was poured from crystal ewers by attendants who kept their expressions carefully blank. Afterwards, used cloths were sealed into lacquered boxes and carried away by the femmes de chambre, who were forbidden to speak of what they'd seen. Sometimes the smell still lingered behind the perfumes. In summer, when the palace baked under the sun and the air grew thick with sweat and flowers, ladies carried sachets of powdered iris root in their corsets, not just for fragrance, but because it absorbed moisture. It was a poor substitute for real cleanliness, but appearance at court meant everything. Even filth could be masked by luxury until it couldn't. In Africa's royal kingdoms, practices differed not only by region, but by climate. In the Sahel and Savannah lands, queens and noble women in the courts of Mali or Benin used smooth stones warmed by fire and then cooled slightly before use. These stones, shaped like river pebbles but polished by hand, were rinsed in infused water, basil, lemongrass, or neem. After use, the stones were cleaned again with ash soap and returned to a special tray, where they were wrapped in soft leather pouches. These rituals were not only hygienic, they were sacred. A clean body was seen as a vessel for ancestral blessing, and those who tended to royal bodies were priestesses in their own right. Some queens used palm-woven cloths dyed with indigo or saffron, chosen for their antibacterial properties. Others swore by dried banana leaves, rubbed between palms to soften them, then sprinkled with clove water. The variation was wide, but the intent was always the same: dignity, even in the most private acts. In northern climates, such as Russia, royal women contended with freezing temperatures and long winters. Wiping with cold cloths was unbearable, so they invented layers: first moss, collected in summer and dried in attic lofts, then wool, cut into narrow strips and wrapped around the hand, and finally warmed cloths perfumed with juniper and clove oil. These were stored in carved birch boxes beside the royal stove, and swapped out each morning by handmaidens in fur-trimmed gowns. The used items were either burned or boiled in lye to be reused, but only a select few cloths were considered suitable for second use. Those used by the Tsarina herself were never reused. They were offered to fire, along with small scraps of parchment bearing prayers. In the Inca Empire, highland princesses used nothing the Spanish could comprehend. They cleansed with water drawn from sacred springs and wiped with soft alpaca wool treated with wild mint and munya. These rituals were often conducted outdoors, behind stone enclosures built into the mountainside, facing the east, toward Inti, the sun god. After the Spanish conquest, these practices were dismissed as barbaric, but the princesses knew what the conquerors did not: that cleanliness was not just of the body, it was a form of honoring the gods. Even in the Ottoman Empire, where hygiene was a refined science, the private practices of royal women remained shrouded in protocol. Each sultana had a kira, a trusted female servant of Jewish or Greek descent, who was not just a maid, but a whisperer of tradition. In the harem, privies were adorned with painted tiles and brass basins. After use, the sultana would be presented with linen squares soaked in orange blossom water. These were warmed by the fireplace and pressed between rose petal layers. Once used, they were folded with gloved hands and taken away in incense-filled urns. The act was quiet, ritualized, and never questioned. It was said that if a harem woman asked aloud for a cloth, she was disgraced. The kira had to sense her need before it was spoken. That was the level of intimacy expected. As centuries passed, methods evolved. Paper became more common, hygiene more scientific, but the mystery never fully disappeared. In Victorian England, even with the invention of toilet paper, Queen Victoria herself continued to use folded cloth, kept in monogrammed cases and disposed of with the utmost discretion. Her ladies were forbidden from discussing the Queen's body, even in letters, even in diaries. There was a silence around wiping that no technology could break. Perhaps that silence still remains today, because when we speak of queens and empresses, we speak of crowns, of jewels, of diplomacy and war. We do not speak of their humanity, the blood, the sweat, the scent of living skin. But it was always there, behind the perfume, behind the silk. In the end, every royal woman lived in a body she was trained to erase. She learned to carry herself like divinity, while secretly tending to the same needs as every other woman who has ever lived. She wiped herself with linen and lace, with moss and muslin, with silk soaked in rose water and cloth perfumed with mint, and then she let it burn.